Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we drift quietly into a world drawn not with satellites or screens, but with ink, patience, and prayer. Before explorers set sail, before compasses found their north, the shape of the world was kept alive by monks in silent monasteries where daylight came through narrow windows and every breath of dust seemed ancient. They drew the earth as they imagined it to be. Oceans were circles of faith, mountains were strokes of devotion, and at the center of every map was heaven. Tonight, we'll travel slowly through the candlelit world of the medieval cartographers. The men who believed that by drawing the earth, they could come a little closer to understanding creation itself. So settle in. Let your mind quiet like an old library, and as the ink begins to flow, let's begin our story, the silent maps of monks. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine a monastery high in the Himalayas. The air is thinner, here almost too thin to carry a sound, and yet, faintly, you hear the whisper of sand slipping through a narrow brass neck. That soft, consistent hiss of falling grains was once the most reliable clock in a Tibetan monastery. No ticking gears, no pendulum swings, just the endless flow of sand. Time, for Tibetan monks, was not something to be watched or chased. It was something to be listened to. The silent clocks of the roof of the world before European travelers ever wrote about Tibetan prayer wheels or colorful mandalas. The monks of Lhasa, Shagats, and Jants already had a deep system for measuring time. It wasn't based on machines or mathematics, but on ritual, light, and rhythm. In the great halls of monasteries like Tashilhunpo and Drepung, time was divided not into hours, but into intervals for meditation, chanting, and tasks. The day began before dawn, when the sky was still black and cold enough that breath turned to frost. A sand clock, called a sagshag, might have been placed on a small stone table. It was simple, a narrow glass or bronze vessel filled with fine grains of sand, sometimes dyed red or golden. These sand clocks didn't measure minutes or seconds in the Western sense. Instead, they measured the length of a mantra, or the time it took to complete a prayer cycle. One turning of the sand might correspond to a single liturgical recitation, perhaps an hour of chanting the Ome Mahane Padme Hum. The monks didn't need precisions, they needed consistency. A day shaped by bells and sandom. Imagine the slow unfolding of a monastic day. At 4 in the morning, a deep bell echoes through the stone corridors. The monks rise in silence. They wrap themselves in thick maroon robes. There are no clocks on the walls, no glowing digits to tell them the time. They know it's morning because the night watch monk has rung the dungdar, the white conch shell trumpet, signaling the change of hourglass. By the light of butter lamps, a monk in charge of timekeeping walks the corridors. He's known as the Chukskayong, the keeper of ritual order. He carries a small tray with sand clocks, metal bowls, and incense. His task is humble but sacred, to make sure the rhythm of prayer remains unbroken. He sets a sand clock on the floor of the chanting hall, near the front row where senior monks sit. As the sand begins to fall, the chanting begins too low, steady, unhurried. When the last grain falls, another bell rings. The cycle is complete. The monks bow, change posture, and begin the next phase of their meditation. There's a remarkable quietness in this system. The monks are not trying to dominate time, they are accompanying it. The science beneath the stillness, though the Tibetan approach seems mystical, it is deeply practical. The sand clocks were not arbitrary. Monks observed how humidity changed the flow of grains. In the high, dry air of the mountains, sand moved faster. In damp conditions, slower. To compensate, the monks developed small metal tuning rods to stir and smooth the grains before each use. There were also water clocks, or kachushag, used in more formal monasteries. A simple copper pot with a hole in its base. It allowed water to drip into another vessel below. When the lower pot filled to a marked line, the monk would note the passage of time by striking a small gong or clapping to pieces of wood together. Some monasteries combined both systems: sand for the meditation halls, water for astronomical calculations. In the monastic colleges of Sera, timekeeping was part of a larger pursuit, aligning the human day with cosmic cycles. The monks, who studied astrology and calendrical mathematics, knew that even these simple devices connected human devotion to the motion of the stars. The chimes that divided eternity, the idea of bells marking time, wasn't unique to Tibet, but here it was profoundly spiritual. The ghanta, a ritual bell, was not just a signal, it was a symbol of wisdom. When struck, it represented the clear awareness of reality itself. Monks didn't ring the bell to announce a schedule. They rang it to awaken the mind. Each monastery developed its own sequence of chimes. One bell for dawn meditation, 2 bells for the first meal, 3 for midday prayers, and a final single tone at dusk, when the lamps were lit and the chanting faded into whispers. The monks learned these rhythms by heart. For them, time wasn't an enemy, was a companion. The monks who became human clocks in a monastery had at least one monk responsible for the flow of the day. Sometimes they were elderly, sometimes young apprentices training in the rhythm of ritual. They memorized the entire sequence of chimes, sand turns, and drum beats. In some remote monasteries, without proper clocks or instruments, the monks relied on observation. When the shadow of the eastern stupor reached a certain flagstone, they would end morning chants. When the light on the mountains changed from gold to white, it meant midday. And when the yak herders' horns echoed from the valley, it was time for evening prayer. One monk would carry a wooden drum, known as a yenja, walking slowly through the hallways. The deep pulse of the drum signaled transitions. Another monk followed, ringing small chimes in the long, silent corridors of the monastery. These sounds became as familiar as breath. It is said that some monks could tell the hour simply by listening to the echo of a chime. The sound changed with the air temperature, humidity, and time of day. To an outsider, this seems impossible, but to a monk who has spent 20 years within the same walls, sound becomes a kind of calendar. Western travelers in the 18th and 19th centuries often misunderstood Tibetan timekeeping. They assumed that the lack of mechanical clocks meant the people were unscientific, but that was far from true. The Tibetan calendar was one of the most intricate in Asia, blending Indian, Chinese, and indigenous astronomical systems. Monks calculated the phases of the moon, solar eclipses, and planetary conjunctions with precision, often using devices that looked primitive but were conceptually advanced. The sand clock was not a limitation, it was a statement. It reflected a belief that time should be measured in ways that mirror nature. Sand, after all, moves like the wind and erodes like the earth. Water flows like thought, and bells resonate like the human soul taught to the monks. Every falling grain was an offering. Every chime was a reminder of impermanence, the spiritual meaning of measurement. If you asked a Tibetan monk why he measured time at all, he might not answer directly. He might smile and say something like, "Because the mind wanders." Timekeeping wasn't about scheduling, it was about discipline and mindfulness. The sand clock told the monks when to pause, reflect, and reset their attention. In meditation, awareness tends to drift. The steady flow of sand provided an anchor, something to return to. In this way, the sand clock became a teacher, a reminder that all things, even prayer, eventually run out. When the sand stopped flowing, so did the mantra. The monks would sit in silence for a few breaths before flipping the clock. That act, the gentle inversion of the hourglass, symbolized the renewal of time itself. Each turn was a miniature rebirth, once a year. During the summer solstice, monks held an all-night vigil of chanting and timekeeping. They used larger sand clocks that took several hours to empty. These special devices, carved from copper and often decorated with lotus motifs, were passed down through generations. During these vigils, the monastery seemed suspended between day and night. The sand kept falling, but slowly, deliberately. The monks' chants rose and fell in harmony with its rhythm. Outside, wind swept across the courtyard. Butter lamps flickered. The scent of incense drifted into the cold mountain air. And somewhere, deep within the temple, the sand continued to flow, grain after grain, like the quiet pulse of the earth itself. It's easy to think of time as something that rules us, something to manage and control. But for these monks, it was something to observe. Their sand clocks didn't demand attention. They invited patience. They taught that time is not a straight line, but a cycle of flows and pauses. In their world, there was no rush to finish, no anxiety about being late. There was only the rhythm of falling sand, the occasional chime, and the steady beat of life continuing. You might wonder how many countless hours of chanting, study, and silence have passed beneath the soft whisper of those sand clocks. How many grains of sand fell as the monks watched the sun rise over the white peaks of the Himalayas. And perhaps most quietly of all, how many of those grains still rest somewhere, buried in the cracks of the old monastery floors, remnants of prayers once whispered and now long forgotten. The monastery still sleeps beneath a gray dawn. Frost clings to the edges of prayer flags strung between rooftops, fluttering lightly in the thin air. Inside the main assembly hall, butter lamps burn with a steady golden flame, reflecting off the polished floor. The air smells faintly of juniper and melted yak butter. In one corner, near a row of shelves filled with scriptures wrapped in yellow silk, sits a young monk. His name is Tenzin. He is no one special, just one of many novices assigned to the timekeeper's duties for the month. Yet, in this small duty, the monastery places a deep trust. Tenzin watches the sand clock with careful eyes. The grains fall smoothly, one after another, forming a growing cone in the lower chamber. The faintest hiss fills the air, barely audible beneath the low hum of morning chanting. To anyone else, it might seem like a simple act, watching sand fall. But for the monks, it is a discipline of attention, apprentices of the hourglass. Every novice monk must learn to manage time before he learns to interpret scripture. It is not merely an administrative task, it is a way of learning patience. The monastery's timekeeping is organized by a rotation system, a pattern that dates back centuries. Senior monks, known as Kempo, train the novices in the ritual cycles. Each day is divided into 8 segments, marked by prayer sessions, meals, study, chores, and meditation. These divisions are not exact hours, but temporal moments defined by the quality of light, temperature, and inner stillness during training. Young monks are given small sand timers that last about 15 minutes. They use them during private meditation practice to learn concentration. If the mind wanders before the sand runs out, they must begin again. Over time, this gentle repetition shapes a monk's awareness. He begins to notice subtleties, the way the sand flows faster when the air warms, or slower when the lamp smoke thickens. Some even claim to sense, without looking, when the final grains are about to fall. The elder timekeepers say that true awareness of time does not come from measuring it, but from feeling it pass through you. The monastic calendar and the stars beyond the sand clocks. Time in Tibet was woven into an intricate tapestry of lunar and solar calculations. In each major monastery, a group of scholars, known as the Sipa, the astrologer monks, were responsible for keeping the calendar accurate. They studied ancient Indian texts like the Kalakra Tantra, the Wheel of Time, which described cosmic cycles and planetary influences. They mapped these teachings onto the unique geography of Tibet, aligning lunar phases with local rituals. Every month, they held sessions to correct the calendar based on astronomical observations. Using water clocks, they would record the interval between star risings and calculate the exact timing of eclipses. It might sound tedious, and it was. Some nights stretched on until dawn, with the monks crouched over metal instruments in the freezing dark. The stars wheeled above them, bright and cold. They marked every movement in their ledgers, noting even small irregularities. For the monks, this was not a scientific exercise, it was a devotional act. By understanding the movement of the heavens, they sought to harmonize human ritual with cosmic rhythm. One astrologer once wrote in the margins of a 17th-century manuscript, "To count the stars is to listen to the breathing of the universe." In that sense, every grain of sand in a monastic hourglass was a reflection of the same infinite rhythm above. When the bell replaced the sun before Tuabeta Sunbeket, mechanical clocks arrived in Tibet. Timekeeping relied on the senses, sight, sound, and touch. But in the 18th century, foreign travelers began to bring metal pocket watches and pendulum clocks into Lhasa. The first known mechanical clock in a Tibetan monastery came from China, gifted by a Qing emperor to the Panchen Lama at Tashalhunpo around 1750. It was ornate, gold-plated and encrusted with small pearls. It chimed every hour, automatically, a marvel for its time. But the monks found it unsettling. The sound of the chime was too sharp, too mechanical. It lacked the softness of their bells, the living rhythm of sand or dripping water. The clock was placed in a side room, admired but rarely used. Some monks even covered it with a silk cloth so its ticking would not disturb meditation. Gradually, a few monasteries adopted small mechanical devices, mostly for astronomical studies. Yet even then, They were secondary to the traditional methods, to the Tibetan monastic mind. Precision was less important than harmony. A bell rung a minute late was not a mistake. If the heart was steady, the moment was still true. The hidden room of the timekeeper's few outsiders ever saw the small, dim rooms where monastic timekeeping actually happened. At the heart of many monasteries was a modest space called the shag kong, the clock room. Inside, a single butter lamp burned at all hours. On a low wooden shelf rested the instruments of time, sand clocks, copper bowls, strings of prayer beads, and a notebook bound with yak hide. On cold nights, the sand grew sluggish. The timekeeper would warm the vessel near the lamp to keep it flowing. If the wind blew through a crack and tilted the clock slightly, he adjusted the angle by placing a pebble beneath one side. Everything was handled with ritual care. Even refilling a sand clock was an act of devotion. The sand, gathered from riverbeds, was sifted and washed 7 times before use. Sometimes it was dyed with turmeric or crushed coral, symbolizing purity. The timekeeper worked alone, often without speaking, for hours. His only companion was the whisper of the sand and the slow crackle of the butter flame dot. It is said that some monks, after years of this duty, began to hear time differently, not as a ticking, but as a breathing, a steady exhale of the world through them. When time was a ceremony in the monasteries of Jants and Sakua, timekeeping became part of daily ceremony. Every morning at sunrise, monks processed through the courtyards, carrying small drums, bells, and conch shells. As they moved, they marked the transitions of the day with sound. The sequence was exact but unhurried. A drumbeat to signal dawn, a conch blast for morning prayers, the first bell for breakfast, a second bell for study, and a slow, drawn-out drum pulse for evening meditation. These sounds shaped the rhythm of the entire community. Even villagers working in nearby fields would pause, hearing the distant chime drifting through the valley. The monastery's schedule became the heartbeat of the land, and yet this system had no clock faces, no numbers, no alarms. It was an architecture of rhythm rather than measurement. Some travelers called it a land without time, but the monks knew that time was everywhere, woven into wind, light, and echo. The monastic timekeeper's hierarchy, though it might sound humble, the role of timekeeper carried quiet prestige. Only those who had mastered discipline could be trusted with it. The timekeeper reported directly to the discipline master, the Geku, who oversaw the conduct of hundreds of monks. A mistake in timekeeping could mean disrupting an entire day's meditation cycle. Training took years. A novice began by tending lamps or cleaning altars. Then he learned to flip the sand clocks without disturbing the grains. Later, he practiced ringing the bell precisely between chants, so that no voice overlapped its resonance. When he finally became a full timekeeper, he was permitted to carry the monastery's main clock, instruments sometimes ancient, passed down for centuries. These were often inscribed with mantras or small symbols of the Vajra and lotus, representing balance and compassion in a world of silence. His task was both sacred and invisible, to keep eternity flowing one grain at a time. The measure of a moment. It's easy to think of these monks as detached from ordinary life. But their relationship to time was deeply human. They too felt hunger when meals were delayed. They too grew sleepy during long night vigils. Yet, instead of fighting time, they sought to flow with it, to let its natural rhythm guide them toward awareness. Modern psychology might call this temporal mindfulness, but in the monastery, it was simply life. There's a quiet lesson here. Perhaps one the monks would never state directly, that our obsession with measuring time can make us forget to live it. The sand doesn't argue with gravity, simply falls. The monks didn't resist the passing hours, they attended to them with reverence. Every grain that slipped through the clock's neck was a silent acknowledgement. This moment exists. Now it is gone. Another follows. The fragile balance, yet even this gentle harmony was vulnerable to change. In the 20th century, when modern clocks and electricity reached Tibet, many monasteries began installing electric bells to regulate their schedule. The sound was uniform, reliable, but somehow emptier. Some older monks mourned the loss of the hand-struck bell. They said the electric tone lacked compassion, as if the monastery had forgotten to breathe. Still, change came. With new routines came new efficiencies, shorter prayer sessions, tighter schedules, even mechanical alarm clocks to wake novices at dawn. But in a few remote monasteries, tucked deep within hidden valleys, the sand clocks still flowed. Their keepers continued the old rhythm, grain by grain. If you were to visit one of these monasteries today, you might still see a monk hunched over a simple glass timer, waiting for the final whisper of sand. Around him, the mountains would stand unmoved, snow glittering in the thin light, and for a moment, perhaps, you'd understand what the monks meant when they said, "To measure time is to taste eternity." Time, to them, was never about control or precision. It was about attention, the kind of stillness that allows a person to hear the sound. Oh, time, to them, was never about control or precision. It was about attention, the kind of stillness that allows a person to hear the sound of sand, to notice a bell's echo fading into silence, to feel life moving forward quietly, inevitably. Without rush, the monks who measured the moment weren't chasing time. They were learning how to belong to it. By the time the butter lamps burned low, the monastery had grown quiet again. Outside, snow drifted gently over the flagstones, muffling every sound. The air carried that thin, crystalline stillness found only in the high Himalayas, where even silence seems to hum inside the great prayer hall. The timekeeper sat alone beside the sand clock. The last grains slid through the narrow neck, piling softly in the lower chamber. The steady whisper of sand was not just the sound of time passing. It was the voice of continuity itself, an unbroken thread linking centuries of monks who had done the same thing before him. The monks who came before had measured the rhythm of time not to conquer it, but to pray with it. Each grain of sand, each chime of the bell, each breath between chancel of it was devotion. And slowly, over generations, this attention to time became one of Tibet's quietest but most enduring spiritual practices. The transformation of time itself into prayer. The hour as offering in Western monasteries. Prayers were often offered at fixed times, matins, lauds. But in Tibetan Buddhism, the time itself could become the prayer. When a monk flipped the sand clock, he wasn't merely starting a timer. He was symbolically turning the wheel of samsara, endless cycle of birth and death. Watching the sand fall was an act of meditation on Parman state. In Tibetan, the term she means both life and time, the same word. So, to measure time was to measure life itself. Every grain of sand represented a thought, a breath, a passing lifetime. Some texts describe sand clocks used during mandala rituals, where colored sand was poured in precise geometric patterns to represent the universe. After days of painstaking work, the finished mandala was swept away. The same principle guided the sand clock. It was a miniature version of the cosmos, dissolving and renewing endlessly. Thus, to the monks, each grain of falling sand was not a loss, it was a release. The long chant of the midday hour. By midday, the sunlight had shifted through the small windows of the prayer hall. The butter lamps were extinguished. The air was warmer. The monks gathered again, sitting cross-legged in neat rows. The deep voices began the Madhyamaka chants, philosophical verses on emptiness. Near the front, the timekeeper turned the sand clock once more. He sat perfectly still, watching. The grains fell silently, their descent marking the slow unfolding of each verse. When the final grain reached the bottom, a small handbell was struck, a pure, single tone that hung in the air like a thread of light. At that exact sound, every voice in the hall ceased. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. It was as if the whole mountain held its breath. Then, in the stillness, the abbot spoke. Each sound begins in time. Each silence begins in truth. The monks bowed, and the bell was rung again, starting the next cycle. What might have seemed monotonous to an outsider, the endless repetition of chants and sand turns was, to the monks, a gentle polishing of the mind. Over months and years, their thoughts grew as regular and calm as the falling sand. When time became the teacher in the discipline of monastic life, time itself was a teacher of humility. A monk who served as timekeeper might spend 10, even 20 years watching sand flow. There were no rewards, no recognition. But with each passing day, his awareness deepened. He began to perceive small variations, invisible to others, the minute shifts in air pressure that changed the sand's rhythm, the faint echo of the bell bouncing differently off the walls, depending on temperature. To notice these things required patience beyond measure. Some of the elder monks would say, "You cannot master time. You can only sit long enough for it to speak." And time did speak, though never in words. It whispered through repetition, through slowness, through boredom itself. Many novices struggled with that last part. But in the monastery, boredom was not an enemy. It was a doorway. Through boredom, the mind stopped seeking stimulation and began to perceive subtlety. The monks called this nyamshe, a resting awareness. Quiet, but alert. A monk who could sit for hours without impatience, simply watching the sand fall, was said to have found peace, not in spite of time, but within it. The mechanical century. By the early 1900s, mechanical clocks had become more common in Lhasa. Missionaries and merchants brought them as gifts. Curious about the isolated land of snows, the Dalai Lama himself reportedly owned several European clocks, each ticking steadily in his residence at Norbelinka Palace. And yet, even as the outside world grew faster, the monasteries resisted haste. The older monks continued to use their sand clocks, preferring the soft rhythm of their ancestors. There's a story, half legend, half history, about an English officer who once visited a monastery near Shigatz. He offered to install a modern clock on the temple wall so that the monks could keep proper time. The abbot smiled politely and accepted the gift. But the next morning, when the officer returned, he found the clock face covered with a silk cloth. The abbot explained gently, "It is a kind clock, but it has not yet learned silence." The officer, puzzled, asked what he meant. The abbot pointed to the sand clock and said, "This one knows when to stop." The inner clock beyond the ritual devices. Monks also trained to develop what they called the inner clock through years of disciplined routine. They could sense the passage of time without external tools. Meditation sessions were often unguided. Monks were told to meditate for one sand's fall, even if no clock was present. Remarkably, many could rise from meditation within a few minutes of the expected interval. Western scientists visiting Tibet in the mid-20th century noted this ability with fascination. Some attributed it to heightened awareness of bodily rhythms, heartbeat, breath, or the subtle tension of muscles. Others simply called it intuition, but for the monks, it was not extraordinary at all. To live with such precision, they said, was merely to be present. They did not try to guess time. They allowed time to move through them, time as compassion among the teachings of Tibetan Buddhism. Few are more central than the idea of compassion born from awareness. Even timekeeping, in its own quiet way, was an act of compassion. The sand clock ensured that no meditation session ran too long or too short, that every monk had equal space for rest and reflection. The bells reminded the kitchen workers when to serve meals, the astrologers when to observe the stars, the students when to pause their debates by keeping time for others. The timekeeper lightened their burdens. He became a servant of stillness. In the monastery records, you sometimes find small notes of gratitude written to these anonymous timekeepers. To the brother who rings the bell with a clear heart, may your own mind always remain steady, even in their invisibility. They were honored not for leadership, but for reliability. To keep time faithfully, day after day, was itself a form of loving kindness. The last sand clocks today. Only a handful of monasteries still use traditional sand or water clocks. Most have adopted mechanical ones, or even smartphones for coordination. Yet, in a few remote hermitages, the old ways persist. One such place is said to be a small retreat near Mount Kailash, where a solitary monk tends a sand clock carved from bronze. Each morning, he lights a single lamp, turns the clock, and sits until the sand finishes. Then he writes a line of scripture in a notebook and begins again. Visitors who come to see him are struck by the serenity of the scene, the endless patience, the stillness, the unhurried grace. When asked why he continues to use such an outdated device, he reportedly said, "Because it reminds me that enlightenment is slow." He smiled, then added, "And because silence needs a rhythm." To outsiders, it may seem dull, perhaps unbearably so. Watching sand fall for hours, repeating chants endlessly, marking the same rituals day after day. But in the world of boring history, this dullness hides something luminous. The boredom itself is transformative, for in that endless repetition, the monks discovered the truth that the rest of the world keeps trying to avoid, that life is mostly repetition. The sun rises and sets, breaths come and go, hearts beat, sand falls. The extraordinary hides in the ordinary. By facing boredom without running from it, they found peace within the smallest details. To measure time became a form of surrender. The last grayness evening comes again. The hall glows with the amber light of butter lamps. The same young monk, Tenzin, now older, sits once more beside the sand clock. His hands are steady. His eyes are calm. He turns the vessel slowly, watching the first grain fall. He no longer needs to count or check. The rhythm lives within him now. Each breath matches the sand's descent. Outside, the wind carries the deep tone of the monastery's evening bell across the valley. Villagers pause, listening. For them, it marks another day's end. For the monks, it is simply another beginning, one more cycle of awareness. The sand falls on endlessly, like prayer beads slipping through fingers. Tenzin sits in stillness, realizing that he has spent his life keeping time, and yet somehow he has fallen outside of it. Perhaps that is the quiet miracle of these old sand clocks. They remind us that every moment is both passing and eternal, both transient and complete. And as the last grain of sand settles, the monk closes his eyes and smiles, for even silence, he knows, has a rhythm. Reflection, the story of Tibetan monks and their sand clocks, is not about the invention of a tool, but about a way of being in time. Their practice teaches something easily forgotten in our age of alarms and notifications, that awareness is worth more than precision, and that peace is found not in managing time, but in resting gently within it. To record time with sand and chimes was, for them, a form of prayer, a dialogue between the human heart and the quiet pulse of the world. And perhaps, as you listen to this, you too can hear the faint whisper of that same rhythm, the slow, steady breath of a universe that has never once been in a hurry. The monastery walls held time in stillness. Outside, the wind swept along the mountain ridges, carrying the scent of pine resin and the faint metallic temps of cold air. Inside, however, the monks existed within a rhythm so constant and deliberate that even the mountains seemed hurried by comparison. You might imagine that life inside a Tibetan monastery was filled with prayer and chanting, and it was. But beneath those sounds existed a deeper structure, a quiet architecture of time. Every task, from sweeping the courtyard to boiling yak butter tea, followed a cadence measured not by clocks as you know them, but by sand, sound, and sun. It began, as it always did, with the chaksal, the sand clock, the craft of a sand clock. In Tibetan monasteries, time was divided according to the ritual day Nyanjog, and each division had meaning. A single sand clock could measure anywhere from 1 to 2 shog ritual segments. But what mattered most was not precision, but continuity. A young monk might be assigned the task of resetting the sand clock before it emptied entirely. This meant he had to listen. The gentle stream of sand created a soft, whispering tone, like distant rain on parchment. When the sound faltered, he would carefully lift the glass bulb, turn it, and steady it on a small wooden base. These clocks were made with exquisite care. The glass was rare and often imported along trade routes that wound from India into Lhasa, then up to the smaller monasteries scattered across the Himalayas. The sand was not ordinary either. It was sifted repeatedly, sometimes dyed with crushed minerals, so that the monks could tell one clock from another. Some sand was pale gold from riverbeds, while others shimmered faintly with mica dust. Each clock was dedicated to a specific ritual. There were sand clocks for morning meditation, for tea boiling, for transcribing texts, and even one for timing the evening prayers that echoed through the halls just as the sky turned deep blue. For the monks, these devices were not merely instruments. They were companions. The passage of sand was like a heartbeat, slow, measured, and finite. Chimes and bells, but sand alone could not carry time through sound. For that, the monastery relied on drilbu, handbells. These chimes were not decorative. They were the auditory threads that held the day together. A novice monk, often no more than 13 or 14 years old, would carry a set of small bronze bells. Each bell was slightly different in tone, and together they marked transitions, the end of one period and the beginning of another. When the first bell rang at dawn, the monks stirred from their woven blankets. By the second bell, they were already in the courtyard, facing east as pale sunlight. By the third, the chant began, deep, rhythmic, and rolling like distant thunder. At first, these chimes might have seemed arbitrary, but over time, the monks came to sense their intervals instinctively. They were not measuring time in minutes or hours, but in states of being, waking, meditating, studying, eating, reflecting, resting. The chime of the drilbu was soft but carried far. It resonated through corridors, across courtyards, and into meditation halls. In winter, when the wind was strong, the sound mingled with the mountain air, sometimes delayed, sometimes distorted, and yet it still guided every movement in the monastery. Time as devotion for the monks. Measuring time was a spiritual practice in itself. The steady rhythm of sand and sound was a reflection of impermanence, the idea that all things flow and nothing remains fixed. During the long winter months, when snow blanketed the paths and traders could no longer reach the monastery, time slowed even more. The monks continued their rituals by candlelight, their shadows stretching across ancient murals of Avalokiteshvara and Tara. Every grain of sand, every ring of a bell, every echo through the corridors, all reminded them that existence was composed of tiny, passing instants. In the great prayer hall, the senior monks sometimes meditated on the concept of Kalachakra, the wheel of time. This philosophy suggested that time was not a straight line, but a cycle, an infinite returning. The sand in the clocks mirrored this cycle, pouring down, turning over, pouring down again. One of the elder monks once said, "To hear the bell is to remember that sound does not end, it fades and returns." Thus, in their quiet way, the Tibetan monks built a life completely synchronized with time, but never enslaved by it. The monastic day, a full day at the monastery, was divided into subtle segments. It began before dawn and ended well after dark. Each portion of the day carried its own rhythm. Pre-dawn, the sand clock was turned, marking the start of silent meditation. No words were spoken during this time. Only the faint hiss of sand was heard. Morning chants filled the hall, measured by the pace of the sand, and punctuated by bells. Tea was served afterward, rich with yak, butter, and salt. Midday copying manuscripts began. Time was marked by the shadow of the prayer flagpole shifting slowly across the courtyard. Afternoon debates and teachings were held, timed not by clocks, but by the rhythm of recited sutras. Evening, the great bell rang once more, echoing down the mountainside. The sand clock was emptied for the last time that day. Every repetition, every grain, every sound reinforced the same truth, that life moved within cycles, not lines. Encounters with the outside world once or twice a month. A few monks would venture to the nearby village to trade. They would exchange yak butter, barley flour, or handmade incense for necessities, salt, cloth, or sometimes oil. These trips were always carefully timed. A senior monk would calculate the sun's position with a bronze astrolabe, noting when the shadow reached the edge of a small engraved circle. They did not trust the clocks of foreign travelers. When British surveyors arrived in Tibet in the 19th century, they brought mechanical timepieces, ticking, spinning, loud with the energy of industry. The monks found them curious but unnecessary. The sand, one monk reportedly said to a visitor, does not forget to fall. And so, long after the outside world adopted minute hands and ticking gears, the monasteries continued with sand, chime, and prayer. When the sand stopped, but there were times when the sand stopped too soon, when moisture crept into the bulbs and clumped the grains together. During monsoon months, this was common. The monks had to place the glass near the kitchen fire, letting the warmth dry it out before use again. When that happened, the rhythm of the monastery would pause. There would be no chant to mark the hour, no bell to divide the day. Silence stretched across the halls. The monks waited, not impatiently, but with reverence, as if even time itself needed rest. These interruptions were never seen as mistakes. They were moments of reflection, pauses within the greater pulse of existence. Because even when the sand stood still, the wind continued, the prayer flags fluttered, and the world turned. To the monks, time was never lost. It merely changed its shape. Reflections in the modern age today. A few of these ancient sand clocks still exist in Tibetan monasteries, relics of a rhythm slower than the modern world's hum. Visitors often pass by them without notice, mistaking them for decorative objects. Yet, if you look closely, you'll see that the glass is cloudy with age, the sand faintly shimmering with mica, and the wooden bases worn smooth by countless hands. For the monks who continue their practice, the same principle remains: to live in awareness of each grain, each breath, each fleeting tone of the bell. Perhaps, in a way, we too are still measuring our days in falling sand, though our grains have become digital. Our chimes replaced by alerts and alarms. Still, the monk's lesson lingers, that time is not meant to be controlled, only noticed. And so the day fades. The bell has rung for the evening prayer. The sand clock has nearly emptied. Somewhere, a monk waits with steady hands, ready to turn it again. But before he does, you might wonder, how did these monks come to invent such a precise rhythm, and what did they believe it revealed about the nature of time itself? The monastery at night was a place of deep silence, interrupted only by the soft hum of wind through narrow stone corridors. Yet, within that stillness, a hidden industry persisted, the slow, methodical work of those who created and tended the candles that kept the darkness at bay. To light a single candle required labor from dozens of hands and weeks of preparation. Time itself began not with the burning of wax, but with the bees, the tallow, and the patient rhythm of craft. In many Benedictine and Cistercian monasteries, Bees were kept in long rows of woven hives called skeps. The monks tended them with the same care they gave to their scriptures. During the spring and summer months, the hum of bees filled the gardens. Their labor was quiet, constant, and to the monks deeply symbolic. Bees represented diligence and purity. The wax they produced was viewed as a sacred material, a gift that connected the natural world with divine service. To collect, it was not simply a chore. It was an act of reverence. At the end of each summer, the hives were gently smoked to calm the bees. The monks then harvested the honeycombs, taking care not to destroy the hive. The combs were crushed, the honey drained, and the pale wax scraped away. The smell of honey and smoke mingled in the air, sweet, earthy, faintly bitter. The raw wax was then melted in great copper pots and strained through linen cloth. As it cooled, it hardened into golden blocks, smooth and faintly translucent. Each block represented countless hours of labor, both insect and human. This was the wax of the wealthy monasteries, the pure, clean wax that burned without smoke and filled chapels with a soft amber glow. But most monasteries could not afford such light. For them, candles came from the less poetic source of tallow, animal fat, rendered from oxen, sheep, or goats. In autumn, when animals were slaughtered for the winter, great vats of fat were boiled down over open fires. The smell was thick and foul, clinging to hair and robes alike. The smoke curled up the chimney, carrying a greasy haze that never quite left the stonework. The monks charged with this task worked in silence, their hands coated with cooling grease. The mixture had to be stirred constantly to prevent burning. Once ready, the fat was strained and poured into long, narrow molds lined with linen threads. The resulting candles were dense, yellowish, and soft to the touch. They smoked easily and gave off a wavering, uneven flame. Yet in their imperfection, they were humble, suitable for those who lived by vows of poverty. The monks often joked, in the gentle humor of their kind, that heaven's saints burned with beeswax, while they themselves must be content with the smoke of earthly creatures. Every monastery had its candle room, or cerarium, a dim, cool space where wax blocks and tallow molds were stored. The smell was distinctive, a mixture of old wax, cold stone, and faint dampness. Rows of candles hung from wooden racks, suspended by their wicks like pale, sleeping birds. The cerarius, the monk responsible for all lighting, spent much of his life in this space. He knew the burn rate of each candle size by instinct. He could tell how dry the wax was by the sound it made when struck gently with a fingernail. He could cut and twist wicks from flax fibers in the dark. Without looking, this was not glamorous work, but it was essential. The rhythm of the monastery, its prayers, readings, meals, and vigils, all depended on the steady availability of light. Without the candle keeper's care, the ordered flow of monastic time would collapse into confusion. He was the silent clockmaker of the cloister, keeping the hours by tending to the flame. Candles were not only functional, they were sacred instruments. During services, every action involving a candle was symbolic. Lighting one was an invocation of divine presence. Extinguishing it, the monks did not strike fire casually. Every spark, every flicker of flame was accompanied by a prayer or a quiet bow of the head. Some monasteries used candles to mark holy days. On Easter Eve, for instance, the great Paschal candle was lit, a tall, thick pillar of pure beeswax that burned through the entire season. Its light symbolized the resurrection, the triumph of life over darkness. Smaller candles were used for processions, readings, and blessings. Some were carved with symbols, a cross, a saint's name, or a date, pressed gently into the soft wax before it hardened. These markings turned the candles into small monuments of time, each one commemorating a moment that would soon melt away. Over centuries, the monks developed quiet expertise in the behavior of candles. They recorded observations in marginal notes and ledgers, how different wax blends burned at different rates, how humidity affected the flame, how trimming the wick every quarter hour produced a steadier light. Their discoveries were not meant for fame or invention, but for the service of the rule, the regular benedictine, which ordered that all things in the monastery be done in due measure and at the proper time. In one Cistercian record from the 12th century, a monk noted that a candle of 2 ounces weight burns 1 hour and 1/2. Another wrote that the tallow of goats is least fit for vigils, for it weepeth too much upon the floor. To the modern eye, such notes might seem trivial, but to the monks, these were the building blocks of order, a science of stability that kept the monastery in harmony with time itself. Yet, even with such care, candles remained fragile. A single draught could snuff out an entire line of flames during a midnight service. A misplaced sleeve could spill hot wax across the psalters. Sometimes, during winter vigils, the air grew so cold that the wax cracked before it could be lit. When this happened, the monks simply waited. They warmed the candles with their hands, whispering prayers to Saint Ambrose, patron of bees and beekeepers. Then, slowly, one by one, they rekindled the flames. The patience required was immense. But in the monastery, patience was the highest virtue. Time itself seemed to stretch around these acts of waiting, as though eternity leaned closer to watch a small, flickering light take hold once more. To live by candlelight required discipline of both body and mind. The monks trained their eyes to read in dim light. They knew the art of turning the page without letting the flame tremble. They memorized prayers so they could chant even when the candle guttered out. Their faces grew lined from squinting, their fingers calloused from trimming wicks. Yet, in the dim light, they also found serenity. The candle's slow burn was a mirror to their own existence, a steady consumption, hour by hour, in the service of something greater. The rule of Saint Benedict commanded moderation in all things, even light. The monks were forbidden from wasting candles or keeping unnecessary flames. When the brethren rise for the night office, the rule says, "Let a lamp or candle burn always, but only as much as is needed to read by." Thus, even illumination became an act of restraint, a lesson in living within limits. The candle and the breath to a modern ear. It may sound poetic, but monks often compared the candle's flame to human breath. The small wavering of air that made a candle tremble was the same invisible force that sustained life in meditation. They would sometimes watch a flame and match their breathing to its flicker, a slow inhale as it brightened, a soft exhale as it bent. This was not mysticism so much as attentiveness, a way of aligning the inner rhythm of the body with the outer rhythm of time. Thus, Every candle became a reminder that life itself was a flame, bright for a moment, then fading, leaving only a trace of warmth behind. The night deepens. The candles in the choir have burned halfway down their lengths. The air smells faintly of honey and smoke. A young monk moves through the shadows, trimming a wick here, adjusting a flame there. His face illuminated for just an instant before it disappears again into darkness. Outside, the wind sighs against the stone. Inside, the candles continue to mark the hours, one slow drip of wax at a time. What happened when the flame itself became a symbol too powerful, when light, devotion, and time began to fuse into something greater than the monks could control? The final candle of the night burns low. Its flame bends and straightens, breathing like a living thing. A small bead of wax gathers, trembles, and falls into the brass dish below. A quiet sound, almost imperceptible, but enough to break the stillness for the monks. This moment, the moment before darkness returned, was the most sacred of all. It was not the candle's light that mattered, but its end, when light became time itself in the centuries before mechanical clocks reached the cloisters. Time was a living presence, fluid, uncertain, and holy. Each monastery existed in its own rhythm. The bell that called to prayer did not mark the same hour from one abbey to another. Instead, every house of God moved according to its own flame. Time was not a number on a dial. It was a pattern of light and shadow, of wax and smoke. Over the years, monks began to see the burning candle not just as a way to measure time, but as a symbol of time itself, time that could be seen melting away before the eyes, glowing, alive, and vanishing. It was an image both comforting and haunting. In some illuminated manuscripts, artists drew candles beside the word tempus, Latin for time. The candle burned beside the script, as though the parchment itself might flicker and fade. The monks understood something deeply true, that all human life was a slow burning down, a consuming of what was once whole. Every candle that lit a monastery chapel was, in essence, an offering, a gift of labor transformed into light. Bees had built the combs, peasants had gathered honey, monks had melted and poured, trimmed and stored. When a candle was placed before an altar and set aflame, it represented a chain of devotion stretching far beyond the cloister walls. To offer a candle was to offer time. The wax would melt, the flame would rise and fall, and in its passing, the monks saw an echo of their own mortality. One chronicler from the Abbey of Cluny wrote in the 11th century, "The candle giveth light as man giveth his breath. Both are consumed in service." Thus, the act of burning a candle became a kind of prayer, a transformation of earthly matter into something unseen. Medieval theology held that the soul was a flame, a small, divine spark sustained by grace. The candle, too, became a metaphor for the human condition. Its wax symbolized the body, soft, perishable, bound to the earth. The wick was the will, slender, hidden, holding the flame upright. And the flame itself, of course, was the spirit, flickering, fragile, yet capable of illumination. As the candle burned, it consumed the wax, just as time consumed life. To watch a candle melt was to meditate on impermanence, not with despair, but with acceptance. During funerals, monks often placed candles at the head and feet of the dead. As the body cooled, the flames continued to tremble. In some monasteries, the candles burned until they died out naturally, symbolizing the passage of the soul into darkness and beyond. It was a gentle, tangible theology, one that needed no clock, no sermon, only a small, steady flame. Candles also became witnesses to life itself. They burned beside ink and parchment as histories were copied, illuminating words that would outlive those who wrote them. They burned in kitchens during winter, over bowls of broth and bread. They burned during confessions, debates, illnesses, and births in the margins of some medieval manuscripts. Small wax stains remain, a melted drop fallen from the scribe's candle centuries ago. That faint, uneven circle of hardened wax is a trace of human presence, still clinging to the page like a ghost. It reminds us that history is not only written in words, but in the quiet residue of lived time. By the 14th century, mechanical clocks began to appear in the great monasteries and cathedrals of Europe. They rang bells automatically, their gears turning in precise, predictable intervals. For the first time, time itself was standardized, no longer flowing with the pace of melting wax or human breath, but regulated by iron and weight. Many monks welcomed the new precision. It made the rhythm of prayer more exact, less dependent on fading candles or the uncertainties of weather. But others mourned the passing of something more organic, the soft, living measure of time that once flickered and smoked and disappeared into the dark dot in one Cistercian record. A monk noted simply, "The clock speaks, but it does not breathe." The shift was quiet, but profound. The world was beginning to trade warmth for accuracy. The last vigil, imagine then, one of the last candlelit vigils before mechanical time fully took over. The chapel glows with 100 small flames, each trembling in the cold air. Shadows climb the arches, retreating and returning. The chant moves like a slow tide through the hall. A young monk, drowsy from hours of prayer, watches the wax curl and drip. He sees in it a lesson that all things fade at their proper pace, that endings are not failures but fulfillments. He does not rush to trim the wick. He lets the flame gutter and bow until, at last, it extinguishes itself in that instant of darkness. He feels the true weight of silence and something like peace, remnants of light centuries later. When visitors wander through the ruins of these monasteries, they sometimes find tiny fragments of candle wax still clinging to the cracks of stone. These remnants are unremarkable, brittle, yellow, almost invisible, but they are traces of time made physical. Each fragment once glowed, once marked a prayer or a page turned, once was watched by eyes that are now long gone. To stand there in the dimness is to sense how fragile and steady human existence has always been, a small flame, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, each burning quietly against the vast dark. Reflections. The monk's candles may seem insignificant in the grand march of history, yet they shaped how humanity came to understand time itself. Before the ticking clock, before electric light, before schedules and alarms, there was only the rhythm of wax and flame, a rhythm that taught patience, a rhythm that demanded attention, a rhythm that reminded those who kept it that every hour, like every flame, is both fleeting and complete. And as the final wick curls into smoke, one cannot help but wonder if time itself once moved with the soft pace of melting wax? What have we lost in learning to measure it by steel and sound? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine lying down to rest 3,000 years ago. There is no mattress, no quilt, no soft cotton pillow waiting beneath your head. Instead, there is the earth, hard, uneven, and cold. Maybe a folded cloak cushions your cheek, or a small carved block of stone keeps your head lifted from the dust. This was sleep for most of human history, a practical act, not a comfortable one, and yet, from this simple need to rest, entire civilizations developed their own strange and specific ways of supporting the human head. The history of the pillow is a quiet one, but within it lies a story of class, hygiene, superstition, and the slow invention of comfort. The first pillows were hard. The oldest known pillows come from ancient Mesopotamia, around 7,000 years ago. They were made not of feathers or wool, but of carved stone, alabaster, basalt, and sometimes baked clay. Their shape was elegant and spare, a small rectangular block with a curved top, just wide enough to cradle the neck. To modern eyes, it seems absurd. A pillow of stone. But to the people of ancient Sumer, this was not an object of luxury, but of purpose. The desert winds were full of insects, scorpions, and crawling things that crept through sleeping mats at night. Raising the head even a few inches off the ground was a small act of defense, a way to keep one's face from becoming prey. The stone pillow, cold and smooth, was less a comfort than a barrier between flesh and earth. It was as functional as the clay pots and red baskets that filled their homes. One more tool for survival in a difficult world. Pillows of the pharaohs a few thousand miles away. In ancient Egypt, the pillow took on new meaning. Here, the head was sacred, the seat of life, of dreams, of divine vision. And so the Egyptians invented the headrest, a small curved platform of wood, stone, or ivory supported by a central column. Its purpose was not to provide softness, but to maintain alignment between the body and the spirit. The headrest kept the sleeper's head elevated so that air could flow beneath it, a way, they believed, to preserve the breath of life even in sleep. The Egyptians also feared certain spirits that entered the mouth and nose at night. The headrest, by lifting the head, offered protection from these unseen forces. Some were carved with the face of the god Base, a squat, lion-faced deity, known for guarding sleepers from nightmares. Even in death, the headrest followed the soul. Archaeologists have found beautifully carved versions in tombs, often beside the mummified body, as if the pharaoh might one day awaken and need to rest his head once more. To sleep was to journey between worlds, and even in that journey, posture mattered. Dreams and discipline in ancient China. In China, the pillow evolved into something more symbolic. During the Tang and Song dynasties, porcelain or jade pillows became treasured possessions, decorated with poems, landscapes, or proverbs about virtue. A hard pillow, it was said, kept the mind alert and the spirit pure. Too much softness was thought to breed laziness, even moral decay. Some pillows were inscribed with phrases like, "To dream of honor, rest upon clarity." Others bore images of scholars reading beneath plum blossoms, or cranes, symbols of long life. The ideal pillow. according to scholars, supported not just the head, but the soul's focus. It was a quiet lesson built into the body's rest. Sleep should not dissolve discipline. Porcelain pillows also served a practical purpose in the hot, humid summers of southern China. The smooth surface stayed cool against the skin, and some were even designed with hollow interiors to store herbs or to allow air to circulate. A sleeping head, resting on porcelain, would feel the faint breath of air through the holes, a strange mix of comfort and restraint. Greek and Roman luxuries. By the time we reach Greece and Rome, the pillow finally begins to soften. The wealthy filled their cushions with feathers, reeds, or straw, wrapping them in linen covers. Pillows were no longer mere supports. They became symbols of status, indicators of refinement and leisure. Still, softness was not universal. Many Romans continued to sleep on simple mats, or rolled cloaks beneath their heads while on campaign. But in the villas of the elite, the triclinium, the famous Roman dining couch, was lined with bolsters and cushions. To recline was a privilege, and the pillow was its companion. In some households, the number of pillows reflected rank. A guest of honor might receive 2 or 3 beneath his arm, while a servant slept without any dot. To rest comfortably was to exist above necessity. The medieval transition when Europe fell into the long centuries of the Middle Ages. The pillow nearly vanished. Among the common people, it was viewed as an indulgence. Hardship was a moral teacher, and the body was not meant to be coddled. Most peasants slept on straw pallets, their heads resting on bundled clothing. Even in monasteries, monks were discouraged from seeking comfort in sleep. Pillows were often forbidden outright, a reminder that rest was to serve discipline, not ease. But among nobles, the pillow quietly persisted. Made of down and covered in embroidered linen, it became an object of beauty. Women in particular valued pillows, not just for rest, but for childbirth, prayer, and even deathbed. Some noble wills mention a pillow of white feathers left as an heirloom, a soft inheritance in a hard world, a matter of head and heart. It's worth pausing here to notice how the pillow reveals not just how people slept, but how they thought about sleep itself. To some, the pillow was a defense, a barrier against scorpions or spirits. To others, it was a symbol of virtue or luxury. And to still others, it was a moral test. How much comfort should the body be allowed when the soul's work was never done? Every culture, in its own way, shaped the space between waking and dreaming, and the pillow, humble and small, became its instrument, an uneasy rest-haven, as feather pillows began to spread through Europe in the Renaissance. They were not universally loved. Some physicians argued that softness weakened the neck and disturbed circulation. Others believed that firm supports helped digestion and preserved posture. A 16th-century English house manual advised, "Let not the head lie low, nor in too deep a cushion, lest vapors of the stomach ascend unto the brain." The language may seem archaic, but the worry was familiar that the body's comfort might somehow cloud the mind. In this strange belief, sleep itself remained a kind of labor, not a surrender, but a nightly act of management. So much of history, when you look closely, comes down to how people managed the body, what they ate, how they worked, how they slept. The pillow sits quietly at the edge of that story, small and easily overlooked. Yet, through it, you can trace the path of civilization, from stone and clay to porcelain to feathers, from superstition to science, from fear to luxury, and always, beneath it all, the same simple desire to rest one's head in peace, even if only for a while. And as you imagine those ancient heads, the scribes, the soldiers, the farmers, leaning back against their hard, cool rests, perhaps you wonder, did they ever long, as we do now, for softness? Or did they find their comfort not in the pillow itself, but in the silence that followed the day's last breath? The moment the first feather pillow appeared in Europe, a silent revolution began, not of kings or empires, but of nightly habits. Until then, sleep had been something endured, not perfected. It took place wherever darkness found you, beside a hearth, under a cloak, or on a straw mattress that crackled with every turn. But in the centuries after the Middle Ages, as wealth and trade began to swell again, the pillow, once a rare comfort, started to multiply. The feather trade, the softest feathers came from geese, especially those raised in the colder regions of northern Europe. Down from the bird's underbelly was prized for its warmth and lightness. Farmers began collecting feathers, not only for clothing, but for bedding, washing, drying, and storing them in linen sacks. Taut feather-stuffed pillows became a quiet sign of prosperity. In the records of 16th and 17th century households, you can find meticulous inventories that list each pillow, sometimes by size, sometimes by filling. A London merchant's will from 1623 includes 1 pillow of fine down for my chamber bed, and another of goose feather for guests. To own even 1 down pillow was to own time itself, the time to rest in softness rather than labor to exhaustion. Sleep as a marker of status by the early modern period. The pillow had become an emblem of class in wealthy homes. Beds grew higher, layered with mattresses, bolsters, and embroidered cushions. The sheer abundance of pillows was both decorative and symbolic, proof that the household had servants to shake, stuff, and wash them. Meanwhile, servants themselves often slept on wooden benches or simple sacks of straw. The hierarchy of comfort was visible even in the way people lay their heads. In some French and English households, pillow shaking became part of the morning ritual, a sign of order and refinement. A wellered pillow was evidence of both cleanliness and control, domestic virtues that reflected moral ones. To lie upon a plump, fresh pillow was not only pleasant, it was proper. The anatomy of softness, what changed more than anything, was the relationship between the body and the bed. For centuries, people had slept sitting up or half reclined, fearing that full horizontal sleep might invite disease or bad dreams. But as pillows softened and multiplied, the sleeping posture shifted gradually flatter, deeper, more yielding, the human spine, long trained to rest against wood and stone, began to sink into down and linen. The curve of the neck met the curve of the pillow. Comfort, once considered weakness, started to look like wisdom. Doctors began to debate the merits of firmness versus softness, and pamphlets appeared offering rules of sleep. One 17th century physician suggested that pillows be made of half feathers and half herbs, lavender for calm, rosemary for clarity, and hops for the digestion. In that advice lies a quiet tension. The pillow was both medicine and indulgence, dreams and dangers not everyone trusted. This new softness, Some moralists warned that fine pillows would lead to sloth or vanity, that too much comfort made the soul drowsy as well as the body. A few even claimed that demons found easier passage to those who slept too deeply. Others, however, began to associate softness with civilization itself. To refine one's rest was to refine one's mind. In 1689, an English writer named John Evelyn recorded his first night sleeping on a feather pillow, describing it as a rest most gentle to the temples, soft as breath, and yielding as conscience. His phrasing is both tender and moral. Softness not as sin, but as serenity. It was, perhaps, the beginning of modern comfort as a virtue. The pillow and the private life, the more comfortable beds became, the more private sleep turned. In medieval Europe, it had been common for servants, guests, or even strangers to share beds, not out of affection, but out of necessity. Warmth was communal, privacy was rare. But as pillows multiplied and bedchambers became enclosed spaces, the act of sleep began to belong to the individual. The head on the pillow became not just a physical rest, but a boundary, the point where the world ended and the self began. The pillow, placed beneath the skull, became the listener of private thoughts. It absorbed prayers, worries, and the whispered fragments of dreams. It knew, silently, more secrets than any friend. Might even say the pillow was the first diary, unspoken but deeply personal, pillow maintenance, and the invisible labor of comfort. Yet every soft pillow was an unseen world of labor. In the great houses of England or France, entire days were spent maintaining bedding. Feathers had to be plucked, cleaned, dried, and turned. Linen covers were washed in boiling water, beaten, bleached, and aired. Each week, pillows were shaken outdoors to release moisture and insects. Servants used sticks or flat paddles to beat them into shape, a ritual that filled courtyards with faint white dust. The comfort of one class was built on the constant work of another. In convents, nuns sometimes sewed pillowcases as part of charity work for the poor. Even then, the dividing line between necessity and luxury remained painfully visible. A single pillow for the sick was considered generosity enough. The sleep of sailors and soldiers, while the wealthy floated in down. Most of the world still slept hard. Sailors at sea used coils of rope or bundled clothing beneath their heads. Soldiers on campaign often used their boots or saddlebags. Even in the 19th century, working men in cities like London or Paris might come home to wooden bunks shared with others. No pillow at all, just an arm folded beneath the cheek. For them, sleep was brief and functional. Comfort was a rumor, not a right. And yet, even these men sometimes crafted makeshift pillows, stuffed rags into a cloth bag, or folded a coat just so, giving their heads the smallest taste of ease. It seems that wherever humans have worked or wandered, the impulse remains the same, to lift the head from the ground, even if only slightly. As though refusing to let exhaustion have the final word. The pillow as inheritance. By the 18th century, pillows had become deeply personal objects. A bride might bring her own into marriage, sewn with initials or edged with lace. A mother might keep the pillow on which her child had slept as a memento. In some households, the deathbed pillow was preserved, believed to carry traces of the person's final breath. in a few superstitions. One was never to rest on another's pillow without permission. It was said to invite their dreams or their sorrow. To sleep on your own pillow was to remain yourself. Even in unconsciousness, softness spreads as cotton, linen, and feathers became cheaper through colonial trade and industrial production. Pillows slowly descended from the chambers of nobles to the homes of clerks, weavers, and farmers. By the 19th century, softness had become ordinary. The pillow had ceased to be a status symbol and become a shared expectation. Yet, as it spread, something subtle changed. Comfort, once rare and deliberate, began to fade into background noise. The miracle of rest became a mere habit. The human head still met the same curve of fabric and feather, but the meaning of that softness was forgotten. The pause before dreams, perhaps. If you listen closely, you can still sense the history beneath your own pillow, the clink of stone, the hum of porcelain, the whisper of geese plucked by lantern light. Each layer of comfort we rest upon was once someone's hard-won invention, a centuries-long negotiation between body, belief, and rest. We no longer think of scorpions, or spirits, or virtue when we lie down, but the human desire to be lifted, to hold the head slightly above the dust, remains unchanged. And maybe, just maybe, that is the most ancient instinct of all. As the centuries softened and sleep became more private, a quiet question lingered. If comfort was once a mark of privilege and power, what happens to its meaning when everyone finally has it? There is a strange moment each night, the one just before sleep, when the head settles, the breath slows, and the body yields its weight to something unseen. In that small surrender lies the entire history of the pillow, from the cold stone of Mesopotamia to the down-stuffed cushions of the modern bed. But by the 19th and early 20th centuries, the pillow had become more than an object. It was now a vessel, not only for the head, but for the private life of the mind. The age of sleep science, the Industrial Revolution, had transformed everything: work, time, light, and even rest. Factories ran by the clock, not the sun. Artificial lighting stretched the day into the night. And yet, amid all this motion, people began to rediscover sleep as something delicate, something that needed managing and care. Doctors wrote about hygiene of sleep, recommending fresh air, cool rooms, and clean linen. Pillows were to be firm enough to support the neck, but soft enough to invite rest. Advertisements appeared in newspapers for health pillows, filled with horsehair, seaweed, or medicinal herbs. Some promised to prevent nightmares. Others claimed to correct posture or soothe nerves. In these promises, you can hear a faint echo of older beliefs that the head's position determined not just physical comfort, but moral and spiritual balance. Pillow. As technology's industrial design advanced, so did the pillow. In the late 1800s, rubber and air-filled pillows were introduced, early experiments in ergonomics. By the early 20th century, the humble feather pillow had competitors: kapok sponge, even springs enclosed in cloth. Every decade brought new claims of improvement, the perfect pillow for the modern body. But something was changing beneath these innovations. The pillow was no longer just an accessory to sleep, but a device that shaped how people thought about rest itself. Rest became measurable, adjustable, manufactured. It was no longer a personal ritual shaped by superstition or class. It was a product to be optimized, a soft engine of modern comfort, the private theater of dreams. And as sleep itself grew more studied, the pillow became a stage for something subtler, the dream, in Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, 1900. The pillow is an unspoken presence. His patients, lying on his couch, their heads gently supported, began to speak freely of their thoughts, fears, and hidden desires. The pillow, so long a silent companion, now became part of the new architecture of the mind. What had once been a defense against scorpions or spirits was now the ground upon which psychology itself unfolded. The act of lying down, of resting the head, was redefined as a gateway to revelation. Every sleeper, Freud suggested, became a storyteller, and the pillow was the blank page. Industrial dreams in the 20th century. Factories began to churn out pillows by the thousands. Cotton and synthetic fibers replaced feathers. Polyester filled the world's beds with uniform softness. What had taken a family of geese, a week of plucking, and a seamstress's careful stitching, could now be done by machine in minutes. The pillow, once personal and precious, became anonymous. Yet for all its standardization, it still held its quiet intimacy. No two pillows ever age alike. One flattens under the same head for years, shaped slowly by weight, by warmth, by dreams. Another remains untouched on a guest bed, waiting endlessly for a sleeper who never comes. Each carries the faint signature of its owner, a crease, a scent, a hollow, the record of nights that no historian can catalogue. The pillow, as witness every night. Billions of people lay their heads upon something soft and silent, and every morning they rise, leaving behind small traces, hair, warmth, breath. If pillows could remember, they would tell a different kind of history, one of murmured thoughts, half-formed dreams, and the invisible geography of rest. They would tell of a world perpetually caught between exhaustion and hope, the wars fought, the letters written, the goodbyes whispered into cloth. All of it held, for a few hours, by a simple cushion beneath the skull. The pillow has heard everything and said nothing. When sleep became universal by the late 20th century, pillows had spread to every corner of the world. Synthetic stuffing made them cheap, washable, replaceable. In airplanes, hospitals, prisons, hotels, every head, rich or poor, lay down upon some form of cushion. What had once been rare had become expected. But in that universality, something curious happened. Comfort lost its sharpness. The miracle of softness, once savored, became routine. The modern sleeper may rest better than any king of old, yet dreams less vividly, perhaps, when all beds are soft. The luxury of ease no longer feels like grace, only like normalcy. Humanity had, in a sense, perfected the art of rest and forgotten how remarkable that perfection was. Echoes of hardness still. Every pillow carries echoes of its ancestors. The stone headrest of Mesopotamia, the wooden curve of Egypt, the porcelain block of China, all were early attempts to lift the human head just enough to imagine safety. Even now, when you lay your head down, there is a trace of that same ancient gesture, a small, instinctive separation between body and earth, between waking and surrender. The pillow remains a quiet rebellion against the hardness of life, proof that even in sleep, We seek gentleness, the slow collapse of a feather. If you listen, you can almost hear it, the sound of a pillow settling under weight. It's the smallest sigh, a sound of surrender, but also of belonging. That softness has been thousands of years in the making. Each century added something, a new belief, a new material, a new idea of what it means to rest. And every night, without thinking, we take part in that long tradition. When we lie down and feel the head sink slightly into fabric, we join hands, silently, with every sleeper who came before us. Reflections, the history of the pillow, is not just about comfort. It's about the human wish to create small sanctuaries, moments of ease in a restless world. From stone to feather to fiber, from ritual to product, the pillow has remained our most intimate invention. It asks for nothing but trust, and in return, it carries our heaviest burden, the head that dreams. So, when you rest tonight, remember, you are lying on a history of patience, invention, and longing. And the next time your pillow sighs beneath you, perhaps you'll hear it whisper what centuries of sleepers already knew, that softness is never ordinary. Imagine a world without switches, without lamps, wires, or buttons. When the sun sank, the world simply vanished, swallowed by dark, absolute, and endless. The first human nights must have been immense things, long, breathing silences filled with animal noises, the scent of damp earth and the shiver of wind. In that vast darkness, light was not convenience, it was survival, the birth of the controlled flame before the candle. There was only fire, wild and alive, an untamed spirit that humans learned to coax, feed, and fear. Our ancestors discovered how to keep it alive through the night, a cluster of embers guarded in a ring of stones, wrapped in care and caution. Eventually, they learned something almost miraculous. The flame could be moved. A burning stick could be lifted, carried, shared. But carrying fire came with risk. The torch flickered and smoked, burning fast. The oil lamp helped, a clay bowl of fat or oil, a bit of moss or fiber, acting as a wick. It was crude, smelly, unreliable, yet it was the beginning of human control over darkness. Every flicker was a defiance against the void. Tallow and Phaetha, earliest candles, as we would recognize them, appeared around 3,000 years ago. Simple sticks of tallow, hardened animal fat with a reed or twisted fiber running through it. They burned unevenly and smelled terrible, but they worked. To burn a candle was to hold daylight in your hand. It was fragile and smoky, yet it pushed the shadows back just far enough for humans to feel less alone. In ancient temples, candles became sacred. The Egyptians shaped waxy cones of fat that melted slowly, perfuming the air. The Romans dipped papyrus in tallow or beeswax, making the first true candles to light homes, altars, and processions. Every flame had a twin meaning, both practical and divine. Light wasn't just for seeing, it was for hoping. The candle as companion. As centuries passed, fire began to move indoors, carefully, nervously. Walls that once feared flame learned to live beside it. Clay lamps evolved into metal ones, tallow candles into beeswax, and soon every room could have its own small sun. But the candle was never only a tool. It was company. To read by candlelight was to invite intimacy, a soft halo around the page, the gentle rhythm of wax pooling, hardening, and dripping again. To eat by candlelight was to bring the stars indoors, in lonely cottages and royal halls alike. The candle offered a private kind of fellowship, a companion who flickered and listened but never spoke. Beeswax and grasta, rise of beeswax, changed everything. Unlike tallow, beeswax burned cleanly, without smoke or stench. It was the light of the wealthy, the church, the crown, cathedrals filled with golden tapers that glowed like captured dawn. The scent of honey and smoke mingled with prayers. Every flame stood as a quiet messenger between earth and heaven. The wax was gathered slowly, each candle a small labor of thousands of bees, a fragile miracle shaped by human patience. To light one was an act of reverence, not habit. A single beeswax candle might cost a peasant a week's wages. So, in most homes, darkness remained the rule, and light a luxury, the slow rhythm of night before gas, before electricity. The world moved to the rhythm of flame. Candles marked time in their own way, not by numbers, but by how far the wax had melted, how long before the wick sputtered and died. To burn a candle halfway was to measure an evening. To see it gutter low was to feel the hour's lateness. The candle was a living clock, but one that spoke softly, almost sleepily. It didn't tick, it sighed. And so the human relationship to night changed. Darkness was no longer absolute. It could be negotiated, one flame at a time. The household glow by the late Middle Ages, candlelight had become a sign of comfort. In wealthy houses, chandeliers bloomed with wax tapers. Servants trimmed wicks and replaced burned-out sticks as the family ate, talked, and played. In humbler cottages, 1 or 2 candles had to suffice, carefully rationed. Mothers scolded children for wasting wax. Old men saved stubs and scraps, melting them together for one more night of light. The candle was both ordinary and precious, a thing both to use and to guard. When the last one went out, the house fell into the kind of silence modern people can scarcely imagine. Wax, smoke, and story. Each flame was also a storyteller. Candles lit the pages of letters, the stitching of clothes, the faces of lovers and mourners. They glowed beside birthbeds and deathbeds, in taverns, monasteries, and ships at sea. A candle's light saw more of human life than any sunbeam. It burned in the quiet hours when history forgot to look. Its shadows danced on walls, while secrets were whispered, prayers were murmured, or books were read by those too restless to sleep. The candle was not just light, it was the witness of night itself. A soft ending as oil lamps improved, even as gaslight and electricity began to hum into being. The candle refused to vanish. It was too human, too small, too simple, too beautiful. It flickered where machinery could not, in moments of ceremony, reflection, and tenderness. We still light them when words feel insufficient, for birthdays, vigils, dinners, and remembrance. The candle endures because it asks for so little and gives so much. A short, golden reprieve from darkness. If the candle began as a symbol of warmth and faith, the industrial age transformed it into something else entirely, a commodity, a thing to be made, counted, taxed, and sold. Light, once sacred, became measurable. This section of history smells faintly of smoke, grease, and ambition. From hearth to workshop by the 17th century, Europe was glowing, not brightly, but steadily, with thousands upon thousands of little flames burning in homes, inns, and churches. Demand was constant. Every household needed candles. But beeswax was still expensive, and tallow was unpleasant. And so, a quiet revolution began in the workrooms of chandlers, the candle makers. The word chandler itself comes from the Latin candela, meaning, quite literally, the man who deals with candles. In every town, the chandler was both craftsman and supplier, a person who turned animal fat, plant oil, and resin into light. It was not a glamorous trade. The smell was dreadful, the work repetitive. Boiling vats of tallow filled the air with a greasy fog. Flies hovered constantly, but for centuries this was the smell of progress. The whale in the candle in the 18th century. The candle met the whale. Spermaceti, a waxy oil found in the head cavity of sperm whales, became the ideal material for candles. It burned cleaner, brighter, and longer than tallow. It also hardened well, allowing for uniform, elegant tapers. Whaling ships sailed from New England, Britain, and the Netherlands in search of the great, slow-moving beasts that carried light in their heads. To hunt a whale was to harvest the night itself. Spermaceti candles were luxury items. They burned with a clear white flame, producing little smoke. They were perfect for ballrooms, studies, and parlors, symbols of refinement and status. And like most symbols of refinement, they came at a terrible cost. The price of brightness whaling was a dangerous and brutal trade. Crews spent months, sometimes years, at sea, boiling down blubber and scooping the waxy oil from the whale's skull. The smell was unforgettable, the danger constant. Each candle might represent a piece of a distant ocean life, transformed into something delicate and domestic in a strange way. The glow of a spermaceti candle was the light of the deep, the ocean burning in the drawing rooms of Europe. This was the age when every household item began to carry a hidden empire within it. Colonies, ships, trade routes, and labor folded invisibly into the glow of a single wick. Standardizing the flame as demand grew, so did the desire for consistency. The 19th century loved measurement, order, and exactness. Candles were no longer just candles. They were instruments of precision. In fact, the term candle power was created as a unit of luminous intensity. One standard candle became the benchmark by which light itself was measured. It was a tidy irony. For thousands of years, humans had measured time by the candle's melting. Now, they measured light by the candle's flame. The candle had moved from superstition to science. Styron and innovation industrial chemistry soon joined the story. In 1811, a French chemist named Michel Chevreul discovered how to separate fats into stearic acid and glycerin. From this process came styron, a clean, hard material that burned brightly without the smoke or odor of tallow. Styron candles were durable, economical, and elegant. They became the middle-class light of the 1800s, not luxurious, not cheap, but dependable. Factories began to produce candles by the thousands, their molds lined up like soldiers. The age of handcrafted dripping wicks was ending. Candles were now precision-made, uniform in color, shape, and burn rate. The soft irregularity that once made them personal gave way to efficiency. With abundance came change. Light no longer marked wealth, but taste. Middle-class parlors glowed warmly during the long evenings of reading, sewing, and conversation. Candle holders became part of interior fashion, brass, porcelain, and glass reflecting flame in gentle patterns across wallpaper and polished wood. It no longer stood as a symbol of scarcity or reverence, but of comfort. People began to describe rooms as well-lit, cozy, or intimate. It was the domestic version of the Industrial Revolution. Every flicker organized, every wick trimmed. The candle had learned manners. Whales give way to coal butt. The world was changing faster than wax could keep up. By the mid-19th century, gaslight was creeping into the streets. Coal gas burned in long glass tubes, controlled by valves and meters. It was brighter, steadier, and cheaper than any candle. The streets of London, Paris, and New York began to glow with a mechanical brightness that no flame could match. And yet, in the privacy of homes, candles lingered. Gaslight hissed and flickered unnaturally. It had no scent, no softness. Candles, though old-fashioned, still carried a quiet dignity. They were not just illumination, they were atmosphere. The chandlers declined by 1900. The candle industry had entered its twilight. Electricity was spreading, first in cities, then in towns, then even in farms. The humble chandler, once essential, became an artisan of nostalgia. Some shifted to making decorative candles, experimenting with color, scent, and shape. Candles were no longer about sight, they were about mood. The industrial world, having conquered the dark, now wanted to remember what it had lost, the gentle, uneven glow of something alive. And so, the candle survived not as a necessity, but as a relic, an object of comfort in an age that no longer needed it, a flicker in modern light heaven now. The candle persists in a world of electricity. It burns at weddings and funerals, in monasteries and restaurants, on cakes and altars. It's both ancient and contemporary, a small rebellion against the hum of wires and the glare of screens. Wherever it burns, the candle still whispers a lesson older than industry, that light means more when it is earned slowly. By the time the 20th century arrived, the candle had already outlived its purpose. It was no longer the world's light. Electricity had claimed that crown. But the candle, in its quiet way, refused to disappear. Its new life began in memory. From utility to symbol once, to light a candle meant to see. Now, to light a candle means to remember. It's one of those transformations that feels so natural, we forget how strange it is. A candle had once been a practical tool, as common and unremarkable as a spoon or a broom. But as cities began to hum with electric light, and homes filled with switches and sockets, something in the human heart refused to let go of the old glow. We still craved that living flame, its warmth, its fragility, its humanness. So, we kept lighting candles, even though we no longer needed them to see. Rituals of Flame the Candle found its new role in ritual. It became a symbol of thought, prayer, grief, celebration. All those moments when humans pause and wish to be sincere in churches. Votive candles lined the aisles like a small, golden congregation. Each flame represented a soul, a hope, or a whispered word to heaven. In temples and shrines, candles joined incense in the delicate dance of smoke and silence. Even in homes, people kept one drawer filled with them for power cuts, for birthdays, For quiet nights of remembrance, the candle became the language of emotion, wordless, universal. Soft. To light one was to say something that cannot quite be spoken. The candle, as memory as decades passed, the candle began to gather nostalgia. It reminded people of childhoods before electricity, of mothers trimming wicks, of nights when silence felt fuller. Even in the busiest cities, people longed for that ancient rhythm, the slow breathing pulse of fire. By mid-century, candlelight had become a deliberate choice rather than an everyday condition. Restaurants used it to soften the sharpness of electric light. Writers and dreamers used it to think. Lovers used it to blur the world into gold. The candle became memory you could hold in your hand. The scented aged. Then came the scented revolution in the 1960s and 70s. Candles became a canvas for aroma. Beeswax blended with oils from lavender, sandalwood, rose, or pine. Suddenly, lighting a candle wasn't just about sight. It was about atmosphere. You could fill a room with the smell of rain, forests, or vanilla, a curated kind of calm. Candle making shifted from industry to craft. Artisans poured wax by hand again, as their medieval ancestors once had. But now in small studios, rather than smoky workshops, each one was personal, aesthetic, mindful. It was as if, after centuries of being burned for light, the candle had earned the right to burn for pleasure. Wax as meditation in an age of speed and noise. The candle became slow. It asked nothing but patience. It burned at its own rhythm, unconcerned with time. Watching a candle flame can be strangely hypnotic, a gentle breathing of light, the slow tilt and correction of the wick, the way wax pools and sets again. For thousands of years, humans have stared into fire to think, pray, or simply feel less alone. That instinct never left us. When modern meditation movements began to grow, candles became their quiet partners, objects of focus, stillness, and repetition. Every flicker was a reminder that light, like thought, is fragile and needs tending, disaster and dependence. Of course, the candle still returned in moments of crisis. When the electricity failed, when storms tore through power lines, when darkness became real again, people reached instinctively for wax and wick. In those moments, it wasn't nostalgia, it was survival. The flame, though ancient, still worked. It didn't need a grid or a generator, just a match, a spark, and a little air. And as the room filled with its golden heartbeat, people often found themselves comforted, not just by the light, but by the simplicity of it all. It was as though the candle whispered, "I've been waiting for you to remember me." The candle's quiet language. Every culture seems to understand the candle in its own way. In Japan, the warusoku are made from plant wax and painted by hand, each one a meditation on impermanence. In Scandinavia, candlelight fills winter nights with the idea of hygge, warmth, comfort, and belonging. In Mexico, candles guide the spirits of loved ones back home for Dia de los Muertos. And in the West, they mark birthdays, the tiny exploding milestones of a single human life. The candle, wherever it burns, seems to carry the same message. We are here, and the dark will pass. From flame to screen. Ironically, in the 21st century, people began watching candlelight on their screens. YouTube channels broadcast hours of flickering flames, the sound of faint crackling, the image of melting wax. Digital candles glow in apps, on websites, even at virtual memorials. The light that once burned in caves, cathedrals, and cottages now flickers on pixels, untouchable, eternal. It's as though the human mind refuses to let go of that ancient comfort. Even in the blue light of our screens, we still crave the warm light of something real. The endless wikwut began as a crude tool of survival, has become one of humanity's most enduring metaphors. The candle's story is not about technology or innovation. It's about continuity. Fire learned to behave indoors, and in doing so, it became part of us. It learned to mark our time, our prayers, our meals, our memories, and though we no longer need it, we keep returning to it, to the way it hums softly, burns patiently, and dies gracefully, because, in the end, the candle doesn't just illuminate the room. It illuminates the act of being human, that small, persistent desire to keep the dark at bay, one flame at a time. If you look at an umbrella, it seems a humble thing. Thin ribs of metal or bamboo, a circle of fabric, a curved handle. But behind that modest frame lies a story almost as old as civilization itself. The umbrella was a symbol of power, ceremony, and the delicate human wish to control nature, or at least to negotiate with it. The first shade, the earliest umbrellas, were not made for rain. They were made for sun. 5,000 years ago, in the hot plains of Egypt and Mesopotamia, the idea of carrying shade was a luxury reserved for gods and kings. The ancient Egyptians painted parasols into the hands of their deities. Their golden canopies, shaped like lotus flowers, an earthly echo of divine protection in temples and royal processions. Slaves held large, feathered fans or parasols above their rulers. These were not tools. They were symbols. To walk beneath your own portable shadow was to say, I am closer to the heavens than you. Paper skies of the east, thousands of miles away, in China, another kind of umbrella was taking shape. By the 11th century BCE, the Chinese had learned to stretch paper over collapsible frames of bamboo. These early umbrellas were marvels of engineering, light, flexible, and beautiful. They were lacquered to resist water and painted with scenes of clouds, dragons, and flowers. In a sense, they carried their own miniature heavens. The Chinese word for umbrella, san song, even resembles a picture of several people standing under one cover. It was a tool of harmony, a quiet gesture against both the sun and the rain. Like paper itself, became a gift China offered to the rest of the world. The umbrella as power from China. The idea spread first to Korea and Japan, then westward through Persia and into Greece and Rome. Everywhere it went. The umbrella began the same way, as a symbol of privilege. In Assyria, parasols shaded kings in chariots. In Greece, they shaded aristocratic women, their delicate linen stretched over carved handles. In Rome, they appeared above emperors, priests, and public speakers, a sign that these people, unlike the rest, need not be touched by the sun. In each of these societies, shade meant distinction. Commoners walked uncovered. Nobles carried their own patch of heaven. Ritual shadows, even in religion, the umbrella found a place. In Hindu and Buddhist traditions, the chhatra, a sacred parasol, became one of the 8 auspicious symbols. It stood for spiritual protection, a canopy of enlightenment shielding believers from the heat of human suffering. Carved stone umbrellas crown stupas and temple towers across India and Southeast Asia, each layer rising toward the sky like a ladder of shade. For centuries, this sacred parasol was not something one held, but something one revered. It was both architectural and metaphysical, the shadow of peace cast across the world. Europe learns to open when the umbrella finally reached medieval Europe. It came through trade and conquest, silk routes, pilgrim roads, and royal gifts. But in the damp climates of England and France, Europe was not scorched, it was soaked. So the parasol quietly began to change its purpose. It became heavier, thicker, waterproof, designed not for sun, but for storm. Early rain umbrellas were made of oiled linen or waxed paper stretched over whalebone ribs. They were awkward, expensive, and rarely seen outside of the upper classes. To carry one was to make a statement. You valued your comfort more than your dignity. For early umbrellas were ridiculed as fussy, feminine contraptions. The age of awkwardness through the 1600s and 1700s. Umbrellas remained curiosities in Europe, clumsy imports from Asia, carried by travelers or eccentric nobles. They were called parasols in France, ombrelles in Italy, and umbrellos in England. Rain was still something to be endured, not avoided. People wore cloaks, hats, and stoicism. Then came a man named Jonas Hanway. Jonas and the English reign in the mid-18th century. Jonas Hanway, a philanthropist and writer known for his peculiar habits, began walking the streets of London under a small, portable umbrella. People jeered. Cab drivers, fearing loss of business, threw insults and even garbage at him. But Hanway persisted. For 30 years, he carried his umbrella through rain and ridicule alike, insisting that Londoners could learn from the East. By the time of his death in 1786, the umbrella had become not a novelty, but a fashion. Men began to carry them openly. Ladies demanded lighter, silk-covered versions for strolls in gardens and parks. The umbrella had crossed the final boundary from absurdity to normality. A machine for the weather once accepted, the umbrella was quickly improved. Inventors added springs, ribs, buttons, and folding frames. By the early 19th century, they could collapse neatly under one arm, a small miracle of geometry and tension. They were made from oiled silk, later from cotton and steel. And as Britain industrialized, umbrellas became one of its quietest exports, a small symbol of civilization, order, and control over chaos. A gentleman's umbrella was not merely a tool, it was part of his identity. It completed the silhouette, coat, hat, cane, and umbrella. It was as essential to manners as to weather. The umbrella in the crowd. By the late 1800s, umbrellas had become democratic. Factories produced them cheaply. Street vendors sold them in every market. No longer an emblem of privilege, they became a symbol of the ordinary, the shared inconvenience of rain. On city streets, the sight of hundreds of umbrellas opening in unison during a downpour became one of modern life's first mass choreographies. Each person, a tiny dome of solitude. Each canopy, a fragment of human adaptation. The umbrella had gone from sacred object to simple survival tool, a bridge between heaven's mood and human stubbornness. By the dawn of the 19th century, umbrellas were everywhere. They had drifted from palaces and temples into the hands of everyday citizens, merchants, clerks, washerwomen, and schoolchildren. Once a badge of divine favor, they were now a small, practical rebellion against bad weather. But their quiet evolution was not over. In the next century, the umbrella would become one of the most familiar, most forgotten inventions in the world. A small miracle people used every day and rarely thought about at all. The industrial cloud in Victorian Britain, rain was not just a nuisance, it was a condition of life. Factories belched steam and soot into skies that never quite cleared. Londoners joked that their city had two seasons, drizzle and heavier drizzle. Umbrellas became both shield and symbol. To carry one was to declare that you were respectable, organized, and forward-thinking, the sort of person who refused to arrive at work drenched. Umbrella shops sprang up on every street. One, in particular, James Smith and Sons, founded in 1830, became a monument to the object itself. Its wooden storefront on New Oxford Street still stands today, filled with canes, parasols, and handles carved into silver lions or ivory ducks. It was the age when even rain could be refined. Engineering elegance, early umbrellas were stubborn things. Their ribs snapped in the wind. Their covers tore with use. But inventors saw potential in this humble object. In 1852, Samuel Fox, a steel manufacturer from Sheffield, introduced the Paragon frame, a design using thin, flexible steel ribs instead of whalebone or wood. This made umbrellas lighter, stronger, and easier to repair. Within a few years, almost every umbrella in England used his method. Fox had turned a domestic nuisance into a precision machine. By the late 1800s, British patents for umbrella mechanisms multiplied: telescoping shafts, automatic openings, spring locks, and collapsible handles. Each refinement was invisible until the moment of use, and then, like a magician's trick, quietly satisfying. To open an umbrella was to perform a tiny act of engineering. The umbrella goes global. As the British Empire spread across the world, so too did its umbrellas. They shaded colonial officials in India, shielded explorers in Africa, and hung from the arms of diplomats in Hong Kong. They were featured in advertisements and caricatures, sometimes mocked, sometimes admired, but always recognized. Even in faraway lands, an umbrella was the unmistakable mark of a proper Englishman. In the tropics, it was protection from the sun. In Europe, from the rain. It became a symbol of civilization's reach, a portable bit of order amid unpredictable skies. Missionaries carried them, sailors packed them, artists painted them. By the early 1900s, there was hardly a city on earth without them. Ladies and gentlemen of the umbrella age, umbrellas became fashion statements. Women's parasols were embroidered with lace and fringe, sometimes tipped with tiny tassels or carved handles. Men's umbrellas, by contrast, were sober, black, and discreet, an extension of the walking stick tradition. Etiquette manuals offered instructions on how to carry, open, and close them without offense. You should never twirl one in company, or let it drip indoors. It should be held neatly, not slung over the shoulder like a rifle. The umbrella became part of choreography, an object that had to be handled properly. Umbrellas at war, even war, could not escape the umbrella. During World War I, soldiers used them not for rain, but to camouflage rifle barrels or signal across trenches. In World War II, British paratroopers were nicknamed the Umbrella Men for the shape of their deployed parachutes. And one curious figure, Major General William Slim, was said to have carried a black umbrella into combat zones simply out of habit, a gentlemanly defiance amid chaos. The object that once symbolized divine protection had become a kind of psychological armor. The age of the fold. By the mid-20th century, urban life demanded something smaller. People wanted umbrellas that could vanish into handbags and briefcases, quick, efficient, and modern. In 1928, a German engineer named Hans Haupt invented the first truly folding umbrella. His design, called the NURPS, meaning little fellow, used a telescoping metal shaft that collapsed neatly into half its length. It was an immediate success, especially in crowded European cities where space was scarce and the weather was unreliable. Soon, copycats and improvements followed. By the 1960s, folding umbrellas were the global norm, a mechanical flower that bloomed and vanished at the press of a button. Cinema, charm, and symbol, the umbrella entered popular culture, no longer just a tool, but a character. It danced with Gene Kelly in Singing in the Rain, 1952, twirled by joy and rhythm. It floated down from the sky in Mary Poppins, 1964, turning a simple nanny into a magician. It shaded lovers in French New Wave films and became a prop for spies in British comedies. Even when not used, it said something about the person who held it: orderly, polite, a little mysterious. In an age of machines, the umbrella remained disarmingly human, fragile, mechanical, but still romantic. By the 21st century, the umbrella had become so common it was almost invisible. Found in taxis, lost in train stations, sold for a few dollars on street corners, an object everyone owned and no one thought about. Engineers tried to reinvent it: windproof canopies, reverse-folding models, even motorized versions. But nothing ever quite replaced the original. The same simple principle, ribs, canopy, tension, remained almost unchanged from the paper parasols of ancient China. 5,000 years of refinement, all to hold a little patch of dryness in a wet world. A gentle symbol today. When you walk beneath an umbrella, you are part of that quiet history of kings and craftsmen, inventors and travelers, all trying to carry the sky. It is a story of human persistence, of small comforts, of stubborn civility in the face of nature's moods. It doesn't roar or flash or revolutionize the world. It just opens, and that, somehow, is enough. Excellent. Let's lower the lights a little further. This final part drifts quietly, less about invention, more about reflection. Story 5. The boring history of umbrellas. How humanity tried to carry the sky. Section 3. Umbrella. Dreams. The philosophy of shelter and solitude. When you open an umbrella, you create a tiny world, a personal ceiling beneath an indifferent sky. It's a fragile boundary, held by thin ribs and tensioned fabric, yet it separates you from the storm. Perhaps that's why the umbrella has followed humanity for millennia. It is not only a device of weather, but a symbol of longing for order, privacy, and control over what we cannot predict. Beneath it, you stand alone, hearing the rhythm of raindrops turn into soft applause. In ancient societies, roofs were a mark of privilege. Common people worked under open air. Nobles and priests sat beneath shaded canopies. To have a roof, even a portable one, was to possess a small piece of the heavens. The umbrella carried that meaning forward. In medieval Europe, clerics carried large ceremonial parasols called umbracula, the same root that gives us umbrella. They were symbols of divine shelter, not mere protection from rain. Over centuries, that meaning softened. Today, when a person opens an umbrella in the drizzle, they perform the same gesture, claiming a little space, asserting quiet control over the chaos above. You might say, each umbrella is a small act of civilization. Walk through a city during a storm, and you'll see hundreds of umbrellas moving together, black domes drifting like petals across the pavement. People hurry past one another, faces hidden, each under their own temporary sky. The umbrella divides and unites. From above, the sight is beautiful, a mass of circles, each distinct yet synchronized in motion. From below, it's isolating, a quiet world of droplets, fabric, and footsteps. It is a companion that doesn't speak, a piece of solitude you can carry. Writers have noticed this. Virginia Woolf once described umbrellas as black mushrooms sprouting from pavements, and Roland Barthes called them a punctuation mark against the rain. Under an umbrella, the world slows, the air becomes private, the sound becomes soft. You are hidden, but also held. Painters have long used umbrellas as a symbol of reflection. In 19th century Impressionist scenes, Renoir's The Umbrellas, or Caillebott's Paris Street. Rainy day, they appear as clusters of anonymity, moments where humanity and weather coexist in gentle discomfort. Philosophers, too, took note. Walter Benjamin once mused that the umbrella was a threshold object, something that belongs neither fully indoors nor outdoors, bridging comfort and exposure. It's true, you can't use it inside, but you can't quite be without it outside. It lives in the in-between, like so many of our inventions, halfway between need and habit. Think of how many human hands have held an umbrella. The merchant in Edo, Japan, the colonial clerk in Calcutta, the poet in Paris, the commuter in New York. Each believed they were simply keeping dry, yet all shared in the same humble ritual. It is rare for an object to survive this long, unchanged, uncelebrated, indispensable. The wheel was reinvented 1,000 times. The telephone evolves yearly, but the umbrella endures, stubbornly perfect in its simplicity. It is a small victory against discomfort, and a reminder that progress often hides in patience. Umbrellas are often left behind in cafes, trains, theaters, and taxi backseats. Lost property offices around the world report them as their most common item. Perhaps this is fitting. The umbrella's purpose is temporary. It shelters you until the storm passes, and then, like a polite guest, it disappears. In a way, it embodies you use it, forget it, replace it, and never notice how much of your life it quietly followed. In the history of objects, few are so loyal and so overlooked. Across time and continents, people have shared the same gesture, the reaching upward, the opening click, the small circle of dry air. It connects emperors and office clerks, monks and students, sailors and lovers. The fabric may differ, silk, oil paper, nylon, but the intent is unchanged. Every umbrella ever opened is an echo of the first canopy held up against the sun. It is the persistence of comfort, a small declaration that the sky can fall, but we will not yield entirely to it. And so, when you next walk through the rain, Notice the way the water darkens the pavement, the hum of distant cars, the weight of the air. Notice the tiny architecture above you, ribs, fabric, thread. It is an ancient gesture in a modern world. You are standing beneath 5,000 years of design, memory, and quiet stubbornness. The umbrella has followed humanity through empires, revolutions, and endless weather. It has sheltered prayers and paperwork, queens and farmers, poets and postal workers. It has been, through all of it, a reminder that sometimes the smallest things carry the deepest endurance. Every civilization has sought control over the sky through towers, observatories, altars, or domes. The umbrella is the most modest of these attempts, and perhaps the most human. It doesn't challenge the heavens. It simply negotiates with them. When you close your eyes tonight, imagine a rain that never ends, and a small, steady hand reaching up, opening its soft canopy to carry a little patch of silence beneath the falling world. If you were a monk in the 12th century, the world did not begin at the horizon. It began at dawn with the tolling of a bell. The monastery was a complete universe, enclosed, orderly, measured by prayer and routine. And yet, within those stone walls, monks dared to draw the entire earth. They called them mapi mundi, maps of the world. But these were not the maps we know today. They did not aim to measure distance or direction. They were works of devotion, theology, painted in ink. Each was a diagram of faith, a way of arranging the known and the unknown into divine order. The monastic mindset in the Middle Ages, to map the world, was to map creation itself. Most monks had never traveled more than a few miles beyond their abbey gates. Their knowledge of the wider world came from scripture, saints' legends, and the faint trickle of rumors from travelers, crusaders, or traders. Yet they saw no contradiction between faith and geography. If the Bible said the Garden of Eden lay in the east, then on the page it did. If Jerusalem was the center of God's plan, then it was the center of the earth. Maps were acts of devotion as much as observation, the circle as cosmos almost. All early monastic maps began with a circle. The circle represented perfection, the form of heaven and eternity. Within that perfect shape, monks placed everything they believed to exist. The most common design was called the two map, a great circle divided by a T-shape into 3 continents: Asia at the top, Europe on the bottom left, Africa on the bottom right. The T represented the waters that divided them, the Mediterranean, the Nile, and the Don rivers at the very top. In the east, monks placed paradise, the Garden of Eden, usually with Adam and Eve standing under the tree of life. At the center was Jerusalem, glowing like the heart of creation, and at the edges, in small, strange drawings, they marked the monstrous races described by ancient writers, men with dog heads, or faces in their chests, or feet so large they could be used as umbrellas. These were not meant to deceive. They were meant to remind every creature, known or unknown, had its place in God's design, drawing from memory, writing from faith. Imagine a scribe bent over his desk in candlelight. He dips his quill into ink, the parchment stiff under his hand. He has never seen the sea, but he draws it anyway, because the Psalms speak of its vastness. He has never stood at the gates of Jerusalem, but he knows it must be at the world's center, for all salvation flows from it. He is not charting reality. He is tracing belief to modern eyes. These maps might seem wrong. North at the bottom, east at the top. Rivers drawn as lines of theology rather than geography. But to the monk, they were perfectly logical. They told not where you were, but where you stood in creation. The Psalter map and its kind one. Of the smallest and most beautiful examples of this kind of map lies today in the British Library. The Psalter map, made around 1260, barely larger than a dinner plate. It contains an entire universe. At its center, a golden Jerusalem. Above it, in the east, Christ sits enthroned in heaven, holding the orb of the world. Around the outer ring runs the ocean, filled with small fish and a few imagined islands. It was never meant for navigation. It was meant for meditation. To gaze upon it was to contemplate order, divine, fragile, and complete. Maps as prayer for monks. Map-making was an extension of prayer. Drawing the world was a kind of worship, a slow, deliberate act that turned observation into devotion. Some even began their maps with invocations. In the name of the Lord, I draw the world. Each brushstroke, each coastline was an echo of Genesis. Just as God had separated light from darkness, the monk separated land from sea, chaos from form. Their maps, though still and silent, hummed with this quiet reverence. The unknown beyond the edge. Every map ends somewhere, and for the medieval monk, that edge was terrifying. Beyond the ring of the ocean lay the terra incognita, the lands of darkness and judgment. Sometimes they marked it with dragons, or the words hic sunt bestia, here be beasts. But more often they left it blank, a soft void of parchment where imagination met fear. To the monk, that blankness was not an error. It was humility. It was an admission that only God knew what lay beyond. The purpose of knowing in our modern maps, every line is a measurement, every coordinate precise. For the medieval mapmaker, the purpose was not precision, but placement, moral and spiritual. Asia belonged at the top because it was the direction of paradise. Africa and Europe followed because they were closer to the fallen world. The maps were not tools for travel, but mirrors of belief. They did not tell you where to go, but where you belong. Silent collaboration. What's remarkable is that these maps were not isolated efforts. Monasteries shared them, sending copies by messenger or pilgrim, exchanging notes through letters, refining details across centuries. A monk in Canterbury might trace the outlines of the Holy Land from a report sent by a crusader in Acre. A brother in Cologne might adjust the Nile based on a merchant's memory of Egypt. Each map was a collective act of imagining, shaped by fragments of the real world and the firm geometry of faith. In an age before photography or printing, this was how the world was shared, slowly, carefully, reverently. A world without movement. It's easy to forget that most monks who drew the world never left their monasteries. The only journeys they made were through scripture, through rumor, through imagination. Yet their maps traveled farther than they ever could. They found their way into royal libraries, cathedral treasuries, and the hands of early explorers. Even centuries later, fragments of these medieval visions lingered in European cartography, long after compasses and astrolabes replaced quills and prayer. Their quiet influence shaped how humanity saw itself, not as conquerors of the world, but as dwellers within its mystery. Let the candle burn a little lower now. The the ink still drying on the parchment. We continue quietly with the monks. As whispers of new knowledge begin to drift into their cloisters, the age when old maps met new horizons. Story 6. The Silent Maps of Monks. How medieval cartographers drew the world. They couldn't see. Section 2. Lines of Discovery. How knowledge slowly redrew the medieval world by the late 13th century. The calm certainty of the monastic world began to tremble, not collapse, but shiver softly under the weight of curiosity. Pilgrims were returning with tales of distant cities and unfamiliar stars. Merchants came home from the eastern Mediterranean with goods labeled from places no monk had ever drawn. And on the horizon, the sea, that ancient boundary of faith, was beginning to call. The world, once enclosed in a perfect circle, was quietly expanding. The cracks in the circle in the monasteries of Europe, knowledge arrived slowly. A single traveler's account might take months to reach the scriptorium. A copy of a Greek or Arabic text might require years of translation. But once those new ideas touched parchment, they changed everything. The neat circular world, centered on Jerusalem, bounded by the ocean, began to show fractures. Reports came of lands beyond the encircling sea. Pilgrims described new routes through Egypt, and the Crusades, for all their violence, carried back information as valuable as any relic: maps, star charts, mathematical texts, and astronomical instruments from the Islamic world. Monks who had once seen the earth as a sacred diagram now found themselves looking at something vast, measurable, and almost alive. Knowledge from the East. Much of this transformation began with translation. In places like Toledo, Palermo, and Venice, scholars worked tirelessly to render Arabic scientific treatises into Latin. They copied works by Al-Biruni and Ptolemy, the ancient Greek, whose Geographia had been preserved and refined in the Muslim world. Suddenly, European mapmakers had access to a method far beyond their earlier symbolic circles. Latitude, longitude, grids, scales, the language of geometry rather than theology. Yet for a long time, both traditions coexisted. In the same monastery, one monk might paint the world as a cross of faith, while another began sketching it as a sphere suspended in space. The two ideas did not compete. They overlapped like layers of vellum. The scholars and the sailors, even before Europe took to the seas, there were men who imagined what lay beyond them. Roger Bacon, a 13th century Franciscan friar, argued that the world must be smaller than people thought, that Asia and Europe were closer together across the ocean. He had no ship, no compass, no map in the modern sense, only logic, faith, and the faint geometry of ancient texts. His ideas were quietly radical. If he was right, then the world could be circled, not merely drawn. It was an unsettling thought for those raised on the closed perfection of the Mappa Mundi. To imagine a round earth was not heresy by then, but it was disorienting, almost impolite. The world was supposed to be moral, not measurable. The Portolan Revolution, around the same time, a new kind of map appeared, not in monasteries, but in seaports. They were called Portolan charts, practical, sea-bound tools for navigation. Drawn on vellum, covered in delicate networks of compass lines and coastal names. They were the first maps designed not to glorify God, but to keep sailors alive. No one knows exactly who invented them, but by the early 1300s, they had spread across the Mediterranean, from Genoa to Majorca, Venice to Lisbon. Compared to the circular Mappae Mundi, these new charts were startlingly accurate. Coastlines matched reality, distances made sense. And yet they were covered in the same careful artistry: small castles for cities, colored banners for kingdoms, saints and winds drawn in the margins. They were beautiful hybrids, half science, half prayer. The monks and the mariners' monasteries began to acquire these charts. Some abbots, curious but cautious, stored them alongside their older maps, not as replacements but as commentaries on creation. In many abbey libraries, two worlds now coexisted. The circular maps, still centered on Jerusalem, hung like relics of certainty, and beside them, rectangular charts suggested something larger, a living, changing planet. In scriptoria, monks copied both, as though unsure which truth would endure. The expansion of the mind, this was not only a geographical revolution, it was spiritual. To imagine a larger world meant rethinking humanity's place in it. If there were lands beyond the known, were there also souls beyond the reach of Christendom? If new stars appeared in foreign skies, did they too belong to the same heavens? Each new coastline redrawn was also a question of faith. Every mountain added, every sea widened, forced theology and geography to converse, sometimes uneasily, but never violently. The medieval mind was curious but cautious. It expanded in concentric ripples, like ink spreading through wet parchment. The monks as quiet scientists, though we think of science as secular, many of its earliest practitioners were monks. They kept astronomical records, measured shadows at noon, and timed the solstices for liturgical calendars. A few even experimented with magnetic needles, early ancestors of the compass. Their studies were small, humble, and private, not voyages, but measurements of wonder. A monk did not need to cross oceans to map them. It was enough to trace their imagined shorelines and pray that the world was still round at dawn. The Catalan Atlas, one of the most extraordinary examples of this new blended worldview, appeared in 1375. The Catalan Atlas, created by Jewish cartographers from Majorca. It combined medieval Christian theology with Arabic precision and ancient Greek learning. The result was astonishing: a map where kings and rivers were drawn beside accurate latitudes, where mythical beasts roamed beside real ports. Even now, it feels half-dream. Its pages unfold like a conversation between devotion and data. When copies reached European monasteries, many monks regarded it with awe. It was no longer a world of circles, but a world of paths, and quietly that changed everything. The disappearing center, as maps grew more accurate, something subtle vanished: Jerusalem's perfect centrality. It still appeared, but now displaced, one place among many. For some, this was liberating; for others, unsettling. The world no longer pointed toward heaven, it pointed outward. The faithful earth was becoming geographic. This was the beginning of modern cartography, not through rebellion, but through gentle erosion, a slow widening of the monk's imagination. The sound of change in abbeys, from Ireland to Italy, quills still scratched at parchment. But now, beside the names of saints and rivers, new ones appeared: Tunis, Cathay, Java, names from faraway lips, carried by sailors and merchants, spoken softly under vaulted ceilings. The silence of the monastery absorbed these new sounds. Even the bells that marked the hours seemed to echo differently, as though time itself were stretching to accommodate a larger world. By the 15th century, monastic maps had evolved beyond recognition. The circular perfection was gone, replaced by asymmetry, experimentation, and, eventually, realism. The monk's world, once spiritual and self-contained, had opened outward like a flower. And yet, even as new continents appeared, the old purpose remained. To draw the world was still to honor it. To measure was still to worship. In their quiet cells, the monks who once drew circles were now sketching horizons. When dawn broke on the 15th century, the monasteries that had once been the universe's custodians found themselves looking outward, toward a world that had outgrown their walls. The world had not changed overnight, only the way it was drawn. The circle had given way to the sphere. Faith, still steady, now shared its parchment with mathematics. And yet, if you looked closely, you could still see the monk's hand in every curve of every coast. The world's first explorers may have sailed from ports, but they followed lines first drawn in candlelight. The quiet custodians, in the centuries when few could read and fewer could travel, it was the monks who kept memory alive. They did not merely copy scripture, they copied knowledge itself. They preserved Greek cosmology, Roman geography, and Arabic astronomy. Their ink was the bridge between worlds. Without their slow, careful work, the age of exploration might never have had maps to guide it. Before ships could sail, someone had to imagine the ocean, and in dark libraries, where the only sound was the turn of a page, that imagining began. Each monastery was a tiny observatory, each monk a quiet astronomer. The world, before it was discovered, was dreamed. When circles globes, the rediscovery of Ptolemy's geography around 1400 changed everything. Its geometry, its grids, its logic, all seemed like revelations. Suddenly, cartography was no longer symbolic, but measurable. Scholars in Florence and Venice used it to redraw Europe with precision. Printers began producing engraved maps that could be distributed widely, and the old circular mappae mundi, though still cherished, began to fade from practical use. But here is the quiet truth often forgotten. The men who interpreted Ptolemy, who plotted latitude and longitude, many of them had once been monks, trained in the discipline of patience, accuracy, and reverence for text. Their new maps were not replacements for faith, they were continuations of it, now written in the language of measurement. Sometime around 1450, in an abbey near Lübeck, a monk named Andreas Walsberger created one of the last great monastic world maps. It was circular, like those before it, but laced with hints of the new geography. Jerusalem still sat at its heart, yet Africa stretched longer, and the seas showed faint traces of coastlines recently explored. It was both an ending and a beginning, a map between worlds. Soon after, printing presses would replace scriptoria, and scholars would draw maps, not for devotion, but for discovery. But Walsberger's map still hums with the rhythm of a world made by prayerful hands. In its circular sea, the ink has not yet dried from the old age, nor begun to spread into the new. When Portuguese ships began to round the coast of Africa, they carried with them maps whose ancestry was lines of latitude traced by navigators were the grandchildren of the monks' inked circles. Compass roses, once drawn as decorative symbols, now became tools of life and death. And even as explorers like Columbus and Magellan set sail, their navigational charts still bore the quiet artistry of their predecessors. Sea monsters, angels, and wind spirits still decorated the margins, reminders that science had not yet silenced wonder. The monk's worldview, though altered, persisted in these flourishes. The sacred and the scientific continued to share the same parchment. Maps as mirrors. A map is never just a record of where things are. It is a mirror of how people see themselves. For the medieval monks, mapping the world was an act of reflection, not measurement. They placed paradise where they believed it should be, and they painted Jerusalem not as a point of latitude, but as the center of meaning. To draw the earth was to meditate on creation. To trace rivers and mountains was to trace the fingerprints of God. Even in the age of exploration, that sense of wonder remained. The compass replaced prayer only in appearance. Both were ways of seeking direction. In some European libraries, those old Mappae Mundi still survive. The parchment has yellowed, the gold leaf has faded, but the ink still holds its breath. You can almost hear it if you listen, the rustle of robes, the scratch of quills, the whisper of men who believed that by drawing the world they could understand it. Their maps were not wrong. They were poetic. Each coastline, each city, was less a location than a reflection, a belief about where heaven touched the earth, and in a way, that belief still lives on in every modern map, in every globe that glows faintly in the corner of a classroom, in every traveler's unfolding of paper in the wind. The world is no longer drawn in circles, but the impulse to make sense of it remains monastic at heart. If you walk into an old abbey today, the kind where moss grows between the stones and the light filters like dust through glass, you might still find a faded world map on the wall. Jerusalem at the center, the oceans curling like petals. It will seem quaint, perhaps, but if you stand quietly, you might feel the hush that once filled these rooms when a monk leaned over his parchment, his breath steady, his hand moving carefully, mapping not just geography, but faith itself. The map was never the world. It was a prayer in disguise. The ink has dried, the candle has burned low, and the monks who once traced the edges of the world have long since faded into the silence they cherished yet. Their work remains quiet circles of thought and faith, pressed between the pages of history. The world they drew was smaller than ours, but somehow it feels more human. Every sea a question, every mountain a hope, every unknown corner a prayer waiting to be answered. We may no longer map the heavens by candlelight, but the same desire endures to make sense of where we are, and what lies beyond the edges we can see. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine those quiet halls, again the rustle of robes, the steady scratch of ink, the slow unfolding of a world that was half faith, half imagination. The map ends, but the dreaming continues. Sleep well, traveler of quiet worlds. Until next time, this has been Boring History for Sleep. Good night.